The bitter winter of 1878 had a way of exposing the truth about a man's soul. In the remote reaches of Dakota Territory, where the wind cut like a knife and mercy was as scarce as spring flowers, four brothers sat around a table in a weathered ranch house. A single oil lamp cast long shadows across their faces as Matthew, the eldest, unfolded a crumpled advertisement torn from the back pages of a St. Louis newspaper. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Mail order brides, he announced, his voice gruff from years of shouting over prairie winds. The Westward Matrimonial Agency guarantees suitable wives for hardworking frontier men. James snorted, running a hand through his dark hair. Desperate women for desperate men. Call it what you will, Matthew replied, spreading the paper flat. But our mother's been gone 3 years, and this place is falling apart. We need women's hands around here. Thomas, his face half hidden in shadow, leaned forward. And you think some city girls will happily come to this godforsaken place? Miles from civilization with nothing but wind and work. Andrew, the youngest, at 23, remained silent, staring into the amber depths of his whiskey glass. Unlike his brothers, whose features had been hardened by sun and circumstance, Andrew's face still carried traces of the boy he'd been before their father changed. Everything. They'll come, Matthew said with certainty. Women back east are hungry for opportunity, same as any man. We offer land, security, that's more than most have. Outside, the wind howled against the walls of the Wilson ranch house, a sound like distant wolves. None of the brothers mentioned what truly haunted the place, the ghost of their father, and the terrible things that had happened 5 years ago when Judge Lawrence and his family had briefly settled in Cedar Ridge. I'll write to the agency tomorrow, Matthew decided, folding the advertisement and tucking it into his shirt pocket. One bride for each of us. The brothers exchanged glances in the flickering lamplight. None of them knew that far away in Boston, 4 sisters were already planning their journey west, a journey fueled not by dreams of matrimony, but by an unquenchable thirst for vengeance. Boston's respectable Beacon Hill neighborhood seemed a world away from the frontier, but in the elegant sitting room of the Lawrence family's townhouse, the West was very much on the minds of the 4 sisters gathered there. Emma, the eldest, at 26, stood by the window, a letter clutched in her gloved hand. Her posture was rigid, her face a careful mask of composure that betrayed nothing of the storm brewing beneath. It's them, she said simply, turning to face her sisters. The Wilson brothers have written to the Westward Matrimonial Agency. Rebecca, 2 years younger than Emma, and with the same auburn hair, though worn in a more fashionable style, looked up from her embroidery. All 4 of them? Yes. Emma crossed the room, her skirts whispering against the Persian carpet. Matthew, James, Thomas, and Andrew Wilson, each seeking a bride to join them at their cattle ranch in Cedar Ridge. Charlotte, 22 and the most outspoken of the sisters, gave a bitter laugh. How convenient. 4 brothers who destroyed everything we had, now looking for wives to cook and clean for them while they build their empire on stolen dreams. Elizabeth, the youngest at just 19, remained silent. Her delicate features, which most resembled their late mothers, showed none of the anger that animated her sisters. Instead, there was something calculating in her blue eyes, something that had appeared the day they received news of their father's death and never quite disappeared. We've waited 5 years for this opportunity, Emma said, her voice low despite the privacy of their home. Since returning to Boston after the tragedy, the Lawrence sisters had lived in comfortable seclusion, their substantial inheritance allowing them to maintain appearances while they nursed their grief and planned. Rebecca set aside her embroidery. Hoop, are we certain this is wise? We could simply report them to the authorities. With what evidence? Charlotte demanded. Father's journals weren't enough 5 years ago. The territorial judge was in their pocket. Nothing has changed, except that they've grown richer while we've... She trailed off, unwilling to complete the thought. While we've waited, Emma finished for her, patiently, preparing. The Lawrence sisters had indeed been preparing. After returning east, they had remade themselves. Emma had studied business and law, though unable to practice formally as a woman. Rebecca had cultivated connections in Boston society, creating a network of influential friends. Charlotte had learned to shoot, ride, and survive in the wilderness during discreet expeditions with guides who asked no questions of the grieving family, and Elizabeth had developed a talent for listening, watching and gathering secrets, the quiet sister no one noticed until it was too late. The Wilsons believe they're writing to the matrimonial agency, Emma continued, pacing the room. They don't know that I purchased the agency 3 years ago specifically for this purpose. Elizabeth finally spoke, her voice soft but clear. They won't recognize us. They only met Father. We remained in St. Louis during his trip to inspect the land. It was true. Judge Jonathan Lawrence had traveled to Dakota Territory in 1873 to purchase land for a new courthouse and settlement. He'd taken his clerk, but left his daughters in the safety of the city. 2 weeks later, the clerk returned alone, bearing news that would shatter their world. Judge Lawrence had been found dead at the bottom of a ravine, his plans for bringing law and civilization to the territory dying with him. The official ruling was an accident, a fall from his horse on treacherous terrain, but his private journals, sent back with his effects, told a different story. The Wilson family had approached him, offering partnership in their cattle operation. When he refused, preferring to maintain judicial impartiality, the meeting had turned hostile. The last entry, written the night before his death, expressed concern about threats from the elder Wilson and his sons. 4 brides for 4 brothers, Emma said, returning to the window where the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Beacon Street. They've requested educated women who can help with accounts, correspondence, household management, and teaching any future children. Charlotte gave a humorless smile. How fortunate that we're so accomplished. If we do this, Rebecca said carefully, there's no coming back to Boston, no resuming our lives here. What lives? Charlotte countered. We exist in this house like ghosts. Father is gone. Mother died of grief shortly after. We have no purpose except this. Emma turned, her face illuminated by the fading light. We leave in 1 week. The spring thaw has begun in the territories. Travel will be difficult, but possible. Elizabeth rose from her seat, crossing to the cherrywood secretary desk, where she withdrew 4 identical writing cases of tooled leather. I've prepared our responses, she said, opening one to reveal fine stationery and a silver pen. Simple backgrounds, suitable accomplishments. We'll present ourselves as orphaned sisters seeking security, using our mother's maiden name of Miller. Emma nodded approvingly. Perfect. The Wilson brothers will never suspect that the demure, desperate women answering their advertisements are actually the daughters of the man they murdered. As darkness fell over Boston, the Lawrence sisters continued their planning, their elegant sitting room becoming a war room where justice, or perhaps vengeance, was the only objective. None of them spoke of what would happen after they reached Cedar Ridge. None of them needed to. The plan had been forming for 5 long years, and now, finally, it was time to act. The journey west was arduous, testing even Charlotte's preparation. They traveled first by train, the rhythmic clacking of wheels on rails, carrying them farther from civilization with each passing day. The relative comfort of first-class accommodations gave way to increasingly crude surroundings as they transferred to smaller local lines and finally to a stagecoach for the last leg to Cedar Ridge. Emma observed her sisters closely during the journey. Rebecca maintained her composure even as the hardships mounted, though her complexion grew paler against the rich green traveling dress she wore. Charlotte seemed almost energized by the challenges, her eyes bright with purpose as they navigated each new difficulty. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Elizabeth remained enigmatic, spending hours staring out windows at the passing landscape, occasionally making notes in a small leather journal. "Remember," Emma instructed as the stagecoach rumbled toward Cedar Ridge, "from this moment forward, we are the Miller sisters. We know nothing of Judge Lawrence or his death. We are simply four women seeking security through matrimony." The others nodded, their expressions solemn. They had rehearsed their stories until they could recite them in their sleep. Emma was a former teacher, Rebecca a housekeeper for a wealthy family, Charlotte experienced with horses and livestock, and Elizabeth trained in bookkeeping. Each profile carefully crafted to appeal to the specific Wilson brother who had requested such qualities. The stagecoach crested a hill, and Cedar Ridge appeared below them, a cluster of wooden buildings surrounded by the vast emptiness of the Dakota Prairie. In the distance, they could make out scattered homesteads and ranches dotting the landscape. "There it is," Rebecca murmured. "It looks so small." "Good," Charlotte replied. "Smaller than Boston means fewer people to complicate matters." As the stagecoach rolled down the main street, really the only street of Cedar Ridge, curious, faces appeared in windows and doorways. The arrival of the coach was clearly an event, but the sight of four well-dressed women caused a sensation. By the time they pulled up before the general store, a small crowd had gathered. "That'll be the Wilson brides," someone muttered loudly, enough for them to hear. "Ordered 'em special from back east." Emma felt a flash of anger at the crude description, but maintained her calm expression as the driver helped them down. Their trunks and valises were unloaded onto the dusty street as the townspeople continued to stare and whisper. "Ladies." A tall man with a sheriff's badge stepped forward. "Welcome to Cedar Ridge. I'm Sheriff Daniels. The Wilson brothers asked me to meet you and escort you to their ranch. They're finishing up some business but should be back by sundown." Emma studied the man carefully. Sheriff Daniels appeared to be in his 40s, with graying hair at his temples and lines around his eyes that spoke of years squinting into the sun. He wasn't mentioned in their father's journals, which meant he likely came to the position after Judge Lawrence's death. "Thank you, Sheriff," she replied with a polite smile. "We appreciate the assistance. I'm Miss Emma Miller, and these are my sisters Rebecca, Charlotte, and Elizabeth." The sheriff's eyes moved over each sister in turn, lingering perhaps a moment too long on Elizabeth, whose youth and beauty tended to draw attention despite her quiet demeanor. "Mighty brave of you ladies to come all this way to marry men you've never met," he commented as he helped load their luggage into a waiting wagon. "Necessity often requires courage, Sheriff," Emma replied smoothly. "Our parents are deceased, and opportunities for unmarried women are limited in the East." He nodded, seemingly satisfied with the explanation. "The Wilson Ranch is about 10 miles out. Not much to look at from the outside, but it's the largest cattle operation in the territory. Those boys have done well for themselves." Charlotte, who had been scanning the town with sharp eyes, turned at this. "How long have they been established here?" "Oh, going on 7 years now," the sheriff replied, helping Rebecca into the wagon. "Started with nothing but a land claim and a few head of cattle. Now they run over 2,000 head and own most of the best grazing land for 50 miles. "How industrious," Emma commented, her tone neutral despite the knot forming in her stomach. The Wilsons had indeed prospered in the years since her father's death, building their empire just as Charlotte had said. As they left the town behind, The landscape opened up around them, endless prairie stretching to the horizon, broken only by occasional stands of trees marking creek beds and the distant silhouette of low hills. The spring thaw had begun, but patches of snow still clung to shadowed areas, and the wagon wheels occasionally sank into mud, forcing the horses to strain. "Land can be cruel out here," Sheriff Daniels commented as they bounced along the rutted track. "Beautiful one day, deadly the next. Winters are fierce, summer brings drought and sometimes fire. Not everyone can make a go of it." "But the Wilsons have," Elizabeth said, speaking for the first time since their arrival. The sheriff glanced at her, surprised by her voice after such long silence. "Yes, miss, they surely have. Some say they've had more than their share of luck." "Others say they make their own luck, if you take my meaning." Emma exchanged a quick look with Rebecca. The sheriff's comment suggested that not everyone in Cedar Ridge viewed the Wilson brothers favorably. "Is there much law enforcement required in such a remote area?" Emma asked casually. Sheriff Daniels chuckled. "Less than you might think. Folks here mostly settle their own troubles. By the time news reaches me, matters are usually resolved one way or another." His words hung in the air as the wagon crested a rise, revealing their destination. The Wilson Ranch spread out before them, a large main house built of logs and local stone, several outbuildings, corrals filled with horses, and in the distance, the dark shapes of cattle grazing on the greening prairie. "Ladies," the sheriff announced, "welcome to Willow Creek Ranch." As they approached, Emma felt her heart racing despite her outward calm. 5 years of planning had led to this moment. She glanced at her sisters, seeing in their eyes the same mix of anticipation and apprehension. She felt herself. They were finally here, at the home of the men who had destroyed their family. The Lawrence sisters had become the Miller sisters. The brides had arrived, and now the game would truly begin. The Wilson ranch house was larger than it had appeared from a distance, speaking to the prosperity the brothers had achieved. A wide porch wrapped around the front, and smoke curled from 2 stone chimneys. As the wagon pulled into the yard, a woman emerged from the main house, wiping her hands on a worn apron. "That's Mrs. Hollister," Sheriff Daniels explained. "Housekeeper. Been with the Wilsons since they started out. Tough as nails, that one." Emma assessed the woman quickly. 50-something, stocky build, with grey hair pulled into a severe bun and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Mrs. Hollister would be both an obstacle and a potential source of information. "Welcome to Willow." "Greek," the housekeeper called as the wagon stopped. Her gaze traveled over each sister in turn, clearly taking their measure. "Though I expected you tomorrow. The boys are still out with the herd." "The stage made good time," Sheriff Daniels replied, jumping down from the wagon seat. "Ladies, this is Mrs. Hollister. She keeps this place from falling into complete barbarism." The housekeeper's expression softened slightly at the introduction. "Well, I try, though 4 young women might finally tip the balance in favor of civilization." She gestured toward the house. "Come in, then. You must be exhausted from your journey." As Sheriff Daniels unloaded their luggage, the sisters followed Mrs. Hollister into the ranch house. The interior was unexpectedly comfortable. A large, central room with a massive stone fireplace, sturdy furniture made of local timber, and surprisingly, civilized touches. Bookshelves filled with volumes, oil lamps with glass chimneys, even a piano in one corner. "The boys built this place bit by bit," Mrs. Hollister explained, noting their surprised expressions. "Started with 2 rooms and kept adding as they prospered." Matthew insisted on proper furnishings, said just because they lived in the wilderness didn't mean they had to live like savages. Emma filed this information away. Matthew Wilson, the eldest brother, and likely the leader in their father's murder, apparently valued the appearance of civilization. "It's lovely," Rebecca offered, always the most diplomatic of the sisters. "Your rooms are upstairs," Mrs. Hollister continued. 2 to a room for now, I'm afraid, until the weddings." The boys have been building a new wing, but it's not quite finished. Charlotte's eyebrows rose slightly at the mention of weddings. There seems to be an assumption that we'll find the arrangement suitable, she said carefully. Mrs. Hollister looked momentarily taken aback, then laughed, a surprisingly warm sound from such a stern-looking woman. Well, I suppose there is that, she conceded, though the boys aren't bad sorts once you get to know them. Hardworking, determined, built. All this from nothing. She paused, her expression growing more serious. Life out here isn't easy, especially for women, but they'll protect you, provide for you. That's more than many can say. After showing them to their rooms, Emma and Rebecca in one, Charlotte and Elizabeth in another, Mrs. Hollister left them to freshen up before dinner. The moment the door closed, the sisters gathered in Emma and Rebecca's room, speaking in hushed tones despite the housekeeper's retreat downstairs. This is more substantial than I expected, Rebecca admitted, gazing around at the solid furniture and clean linens. They've created a real home here, built on blood money, Charlotte reminded her sharply. Don't be fooled by comfortable chairs and pretty curtains. Emma moved to the window, which overlooked the ranch yard and the rolling prairie beyond. We need to learn everything we can before they return. The layout of the house, the routine, who visits, where they keep important papers. Elizabeth had been quietly opening drawers and cabinets, her methodical search revealing nothing of interest until she checked beneath the bed. She emerged with a small metal box, locked but not heavy. What did you find? Emma asked, crossing the room quickly. I'm not sure. Elizabeth turned the box over in her hands, but they tried to hide it. A sudden commotion outside drew their attention back to the window. Riders were approaching, 4 men on horseback, silhouetted against the late afternoon sun. They're here, Charlotte said unnecessarily, her voice tight with tension. Emma took a deep breath, steadying herself. Remember who we are. Remember why we're here. And remember, we know nothing about them, but they know even less about us. Elizabeth quickly returned the box to its hiding place, and the sisters made final adjustments to their appearances, smoothing skirts, tucking stray hairs, pinching color into pale cheeks. The moment they had planned for over 5 long years had finally arrived. They descended the stairs as the front door opened, revealing the 4 Wilson brothers in the flesh. They were trail-dusty and weather-beaten, but even in their work clothes, they cut impressive figures, tall, broad-shouldered men, hardened by years of frontier life. Time seemed to slow as the 2 groups regarded each other in silence. Emma's gaze fixed immediately on the tallest man, who stood slightly ahead of the others. Matthew Wilson, she presumed. His dark hair was streaked with premature gray at the temples, and a scar ran along his jawline. His eyes, a startling pale blue against his sun-darkened skin, widened slightly at the sight of the 4 women. Well, he said after a moment, his voice deep and controlled, it seems our guests have arrived early. Mrs. Hollister appeared from the kitchen. Stage made good time. Sheriff Daniels brought them out. These are the Miller sisters, Emma, Rebecca, Charlotte, and Elizabeth. Matthew stepped forward, removing his hat in a gesture that seemed both courteous and somewhat uncomfortable, as though social niceties were a language he rarely spoke. Matthew Wilson, he introduced himself, confirming Emma's assumption. These are my brothers, James, Thomas, and Andrew. Each man nodded as his name was called. James, perhaps a year or 2 younger than Matthew, had the same dark hair, but a leaner build and watchful eyes. Thomas was stockier, with a reddish beard and a permanent furrow between his brows. Andrew, the youngest, stood slightly apart from his brothers, his expression guarded but curious. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken questions and expectations. These men had ordered brides from a catalogue, and now those brides stood before them, not the desperate plain women they might have expected, but 4 composed, attractive sisters with unreadable expressions. "Well," Mrs. Hollister said briskly, breaking the tension, "dinner's nearly ready. You men get cleaned up. No trail dust at my table." As the brothers retreated to wash away the day's grime, Emma exchanged quick glances with her sisters. The first meeting had gone as well as could be expected. The Wilson brothers had shown surprise, but no recognition. They truly had never seen the daughters of Judge Lawrence. The next phase of their plan could begin. Now they would need to cement their positions, gain the brothers' trust, and begin the careful work of uncovering evidence of their father's murder. And then, when the time was right, they would have their revenge. The dinner that followed was a strange affair. 4 women raised in Boston society, seated across from 4 frontier men, with Mrs. Hollister presiding from the head of the table like a stern schoolmistress. The conversation was stilted at first, with Matthew asking polite questions about their journey west and Rebecca providing most of the answers. As the meal progressed, Emma observed the dynamics between the brothers. Matthew was clearly the leader, making decisions and speaking for the group. James deferred to Matthew, but occasionally exchanged sardonic glances with Thomas when their elder brother wasn't looking. Thomas spoke little, but ate with single-minded focus. And Andrew, the youngest, seemed the most uncomfortable with the situation, his gaze rarely rising from his plate, except to steal quick looks at Elizabeth. "We've prepared the south pasture for spring calving," Matthew was explaining, apparently assuming that details of ranch operations would interest his future bride. "The new breeding stock from Texas is showing promise." Emma nodded as though this information was fascinating. "How extensive are your holdings, Mr. Wilson?" Matthew's expression showed a flicker of pride. "Nearly 15,000 acres now. Not all of it connected, but we've secured the best water rights in the territory." "Impressive," Emma commented. "You've accomplished a great deal in..." "How long have you been in Dakota Territory?" 7 years, Matthew replied. "I came up from Missouri after the war with nothing but 4 horses and a dream." His tone suggested this was a story he'd told many times, a creation myth for the Wilson Empire. "And no obstacles to your success?" Charlotte asked innocently. "No, competing interests for such valuable land." A brief silence fell over the table. James and Thomas exchanged glances, while Andrew suddenly became very interested in his potatoes. "There were challenges," Matthew acknowledged carefully. "There always are in new territories, but we persevered." Emma noted the evasion. "I understand. A judge once planned to establish a territorial court here," she ventured, watching closely for their reactions. Mrs. Hollister was the one who responded. "Judge Lawrence, you mean?" "Yes, that was a tragedy. Fell from his horse into Serpent Ravine about 5 years back. Would have changed things around here, having a proper courthouse." Emma kept her expression neutral, despite the surge of emotion at hearing her father's name spoken so casually. "How unfortunate," she murmured. "Very," Matthew agreed, his face unreadable. "More coffee, Miss Miller?" The conversation shifted to safer topics, the challenges of frontier housekeeping, the planned expansion of the ranch house, the spring social events in Cedar Ridge. Throughout it all, Emma maintained her pleasant facade while cataloging every reaction, every glance between the brothers when certain subjects arose. Later that night, as the sisters gathered again in whispered conference, they compared observations. "Andrew knows something," Elizabeth said with quiet certainty. "He can barely look at any of us without guilt in his eyes." "Matthew's the one to watch," Emma countered. "He controls everything, including what his brothers say and don't say." Charlotte paced the small room, her frustration evident. It could take months. We need to find Father's journals or any evidence they kept." "We have time," Emma reminded her. They won't rush the weddings. Matthew at least will want to be sure of what he's getting. Rebecca, who had been silent, finally spoke. What if they're not what we expected? What if... Don't, Charlotte interrupted sharply. Don't start making excuses for them. They killed Father. They left us alone. They built this ranch on our suffering. Rebecca shook her head. I'm not making excuses. I'm saying we need to be absolutely certain before we act. Justice requires certainty. Emma moved to the window, gazing out at the moonlit prairie. We'll find the truth. And when we do, the Wilson brothers will pay for what they've done, not just to Father, but to us, to the lives we might have had. Outside, a wolf howled in the distance, the sound echoing across the empty land. Emma shivered despite herself. They had crossed a threshold today, entering the world of their enemies. There would be no going back until their work was done. What none of the sisters realized was that in the room below, Matthew Wilson sat alone by the dying fire, a glass of whiskey in his hand and doubt in his mind. The arrival of the Miller sisters had awakened something he'd tried to bury 5 years ago, something that had happened at Serpent Ravine on the day Judge Lawrence died, something none of his brothers ever talked about, but that haunted their dreams nonetheless. They're hiding something, he murmured to the empty room, just like we are. The game had begun, but neither side yet realized that the other was playing as well. Dawn broke over Willow Creek Ranch with a golden light that belied the tensions. Simmering beneath the surface, Emma rose early, having slept little. From her window, she watched as the ranch came to life. Ranch hands emerging from the bunkhouse, horses being led to corrals, smoke rising from the cookhouse chimney. The Wilson operation was substantial, far more impressive than she had imagined. During those years of planning in Boston, she dressed carefully in a simple blue dress, appropriate for a schoolteacher, her purported profession, and pinned her hair in a practical but becoming style. Every detail of her appearance was calculated to project capability without threatening Matthew Wilson's authority. Today would begin the delicate work of inserting herself into the workings of the ranch, positioning herself to access information. When she descended to the kitchen, she found Mrs. Hollister already preparing breakfast, the sleeves of her dress rolled up as she kneaded dough for biscuits. "You're up early, Miss Miller," the housekeeper observed, not pausing in her work. "I've always been an early riser," Emma replied, moving to wash her hands at the basin. "May I help? I'm quite capable in a kitchen." Mrs. Hollister looked surprised, but nodded toward a bowl of eggs. "Those need beating for the cowboys' breakfast. 10 dozen. Emma rolled up her own sleeves and set to work, recognizing the test for what it was. The two women worked in companionable silence for several minutes before Mrs. Hollister spoke again. "The boys usually take their breakfast in the main house before heading out. Matthew's been up since before dawn. Spring calving keeps them busy day and night." "I imagine running such a large operation requires constant attention," Emma commented, breaking eggs with practiced efficiency despite her years of having servants in Boston. "Indeed it does." Mrs. Hollister slid biscuit dough onto a baking sheet, which is why they need wives. Not just for companionship, mind you, but partners. This territory breaks men who try to conquer it alone. Emma nodded thoughtfully, and yet the Wilson brothers have managed quite well so far. Mrs. Hollister's hands stilled briefly. They've survived. But there's a difference between surviving and living, Miss Miller. These past 5 years especially, there's been a heaviness to this place. 5 years. Emma kept her tone casual, despite her racing heart. What happened 5 years ago? Before the housekeeper could answer, the back door opened and Matthew Wilson entered, bringing with him the scent of horses and the outdoors. He paused when he saw Emma at the work table, her hands covered in egg. "Miss Miller," he greeted her, removing his hat. "You're up early." "As are you, Mr. Wilson." Emma offered a small smile, continuing her task. "I was just assisting Mrs. Hollister with breakfast. Preparations Something like approval flashed in Matthew's eyes. Most city women would consider such work beneath them. "I'm not most city women," Emma replied evenly. "And I didn't come west expecting to maintain Boston standards. Adaptation is necessary. For survival, is it not?" Matthew studied her for a moment before nodding. "Indeed it is. Many who came to Dakota Territory learned that lesson too late." A comfortable house was appearing less and less like an appropriately difficult penance for the Wilson brothers, with each passing minute. Emma reminded herself not to be deceived by the civilized veneer of Willow Creek Ranch. These men had blood on their hands. Her father's blood. By the time the other sisters appeared for breakfast, the main dining room table was laden with food. The 3 remaining Wilson brothers arrived together, freshly washed but already dressed for the day's work ahead. The table arrangement naturally paired each brother with their intended bride. Matthew at the head with Emma to his right, James beside Rebecca, Thomas across from Charlotte, and Andrew at the foot with Elizabeth nearby. As they ate, Matthew outlined the day ahead. "James and I will be checking the south pasture where the new calves are dropping. Thomas, you'll take some men to repair the line shack by Cottonwood Creek. Andrew, you're to ride into town for supplies and mail." His brothers nodded, accepting the assignments without question. Emma noted how naturally Matthew assumed command and how readily the others deferred to him. The dynamics matched what she had observed the night before. Matthew was unquestionably the head of the family. "Perhaps Miss Elizabeth could accompany Andrew to town," Matthew continued, surprising everyone at the table. "She mentioned an interest in bookkeeping. The bank manager, Mr. Pearson, has been asking for someone with skill in numbers to review his ledgers. It might be an opportunity to make introductions." Andrew looked up, a flush creeping into his face. Of course, if Miss Elizabeth would like to come." All eyes turned to Elizabeth, who maintained her composed expression despite being volunteered. "I would be pleased to visit town again," she said softly. Emma exchanged a quick glance with her youngest sister. This was an unexpected opportunity. Elizabeth in town could gather valuable information about how the Wilsons were viewed by the townspeople, perhaps even visit the county records office. "And Miss Emma," Matthew added, "I thought you might like to see the schoolhouse in Cedar Ridge. They've been without a teacher since Christmas. If we're to be married, you might wish to continue your profession." The mention of marriage so casually, as though it were already settled, sent a chill through Emma, but she kept her smile in place. "That's thoughtful, Mr. Wilson. I would indeed like to see the school. My brothers and I discussed the matter of our arrangement last night," Matthew continued, his gaze steady on Emma's face. "We propose a month of courtship before any formal commitments are made. It seems only fair that both sides have time to determine if the matches are suitable." Rebecca spoke up, her voice calm despite the hint of steel beneath it. "That seems very reasonable, Mr. Wilson. A month will give us all time to become better acquainted, and to be sure of our choices," Charlotte added pointedly. James chuckled, speaking for the first time that morning. "Fair warning, ladies. Living out here isn't for the faint of heart. Many a mail-order bride has turned tail after seeing what frontier life truly entails." "We're made of sterner stuff than you might imagine, Mr. Wilson," Charlotte replied, meeting his gaze directly. Thomas grunted what might have been approval. "We'll see." After breakfast, the group dispersed to their assigned tasks. Andrew went to hitch the wagon for the trip to town, with Elizabeth accompanying him. Matthew instructed Emma to wait while he attended to some business, promising to take her to the schoolhouse afterward. Left momentarily alone with her sisters, Emma seized the opportunity for a quick conference. "Elizabeth, be observant in town," she instructed in low tones. "Note how people react to the Wilson name. If possible, find the county records office." Elizabeth nodded. "I'll be careful." "And Charlotte," Emma continued. Try to learn the layout of the ranch. We need to know every building, every path. Already working on it, Charlotte confirmed. I spotted a small cabin behind the main house that might be worth investigating. Rebecca frowned. We should be cautious. Mrs. Hollister watches everything. Which is why we need to win her trust, Emma replied. She knows more about this place and these men than anyone. Their whispered conference was interrupted by the return of Matthew, who had changed into a clean shirt and vest. Despite herself, Emma noted that he cut an impressive figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with a face that might have been handsome if not for the hardness around his eyes. "Ready, Miss Miller?" he asked, offering his arm in a surprisingly gentlemanly gesture. Emma accepted it, feeling the solid muscle beneath the fabric of his sleeve. "Yes, Mr. Wilson." They walked together to the stables, where a gleaming black buggy awaited them. As Matthew helped her up onto the seat, his hands firm but respectful. At her waist, Emma found herself momentarily unsettled by the physical proximity to the man she believed had murdered her father. "The schoolhouse is about 3 miles from the ranch," Matthew explained as he took the reins. "Not far from town, but far enough that the children from outlying homesteads can reach it easily." As they drove, the landscape opened up around them, rolling. Prairie interspersed with stands of cottonwood trees, marking the courses of creeks and small rivers. In the distance, cattle grazed on the spring grass, dark shapes against the green-gold landscape. "It's beautiful," Emma admitted, the words escaping before she could stop them. Matthew glanced at her, a hint of pride in his expression. "It is. Brutal sometimes, but beautiful always. The first time I saw this land, I knew I'd found home." "When was that?" Emma asked, sensing an opening. 1871, right after the war. Matthew's hands were steady on the reins, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I'd had enough of fighting and dying, wanted to build something instead of destroy. My brothers felt the same." Emma noted the timeline. 2 years before her father had traveled to Dakota Territory to purchase land for the courthouse. "You were in the war together." "James and I were. Thomas was too young. Andrew was just a boy." A shadow crossed Matthew's face. "Our father died at Shiloh. After that, I looked after the family." This was new information. The Wilson patriarch had died during the war, not in Dakota Territory, as Emma had assumed. She filed this away for consideration. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said, the words automatic despite the incongruity of expressing sympathy to her enemy. Matthew shrugged slightly. "It was a long time ago. We've made our own way since." He gestured ahead, where a small wooden building was visible on a low rise. "There's the school." The Cedar Ridge schoolhouse was a modest structure with a bell tower and 6 windows. When they entered, Emma found a single room with rows of rough-hewn desks, a larger desk at the front for the teacher, and a blackboard covering one wall. A pot-bellied stove stood in the center, currently cold despite the lingering chill in the air. "The last teacher was Miss Abernathy from Minnesota," Matthew explained. "Good woman. But her mother fell ill and she had to return home. The children have been without formal education since then." Emma walked to the teacher's desk, running her fingers along its scarred surface. Despite everything, she felt a pull toward the purpose of this place. She had actually taught briefly in Boston before her father's death, finding satisfaction in shaping young minds. "How many students?" she asked, professional interest momentarily overriding her ulterior motives. 23 at last count, ranging from 6 to 16 years old. Some only come when farm work allows, especially the older boys." Emma nodded, studying the classroom. "The building seems sound, but it needs supplies. Books, paper, new chalk." Matthew watched her with an unreadable expression. "Do you miss teaching, Miss Miller?" The question caught her off guard. Yes, I suppose I do." "Then perhaps this arrangement may serve both our interests," he said carefully. Cedar Ridge needs a teacher. You need security. He paused. And I need a wife who understands the value of education. Any children we might have would deserve nothing less. The casual mention of children, their children, sent a jolt through Emma. The idea of bearing this man's children, of creating a family with him, was so far removed from her purpose here that she nearly laughed aloud at the absurdity. Instead, she kept her expression neutral. You seem to have given considerable thought to the future, Mr. Wilson. I've learned that success requires planning, he replied. Nothing worthwhile happens by accident. He hesitated, then added more quietly, and nothing good comes from acting in haste. There was something in his tone that caught Emma's attention, a hint of regret, perhaps. Before she could pursue it, Matthew glanced at his pocket watch. We should continue our tour. I'd like to show you the town, introduce you to some people. As they left the schoolhouse, Emma noticed a small cemetery on a hill beyond. Who's buried there? She asked, though she already suspected the answer. Matthew's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Various townspeople, and a judge who passed through some years back, fell from his horse at Serpent Ravine. He pointed to a distant outcropping of rocks. Over there, dangerous place. How unfortunate, Emma murmured, her heart pounding as she realized her father was buried on this very hillside, likely in an unmarked grave far from his family. Did you know him well? Matthew's hands tightened on the reins. Not well, no, he wasn't here long. The lie slid easily from his lips, confirming what Emma already knew. The Wilson brothers were hiding the truth about Judge Lawrence's death. In town, Matthew introduced Emma to various shopkeepers and citizens, all of whom greeted him with a mixture of respect and wariness that she found telling. The Wilson name carried weight in Cedar Ridge, but not necessarily affection. At the general store, they encountered Elizabeth and Andrew, who were loading supplies into a wagon. Elizabeth gave Emma a subtle nod, indicating she had made progress on her assigned task. Miss Elizabeth has made quite an impression on Mr. Pearson at the bank, Andrew reported, a hint of pride in his voice. He's offered her work reviewing his ledgers 3 days a week. Has he indeed? Matthew raised an eyebrow. And did you accept, Miss Elizabeth? I did, Elizabeth replied softly. It seems a good opportunity to become acquainted with the community. Matthew nodded approvingly. Very sensible. As they prepared to depart, the door to the general store opened and Sheriff Daniels entered. He tipped his hat to Emma and Elizabeth, then addressed Matthew. Wilson got a moment. Matthew excused himself, stepping aside to converse with the sheriff in low tones. Though Emma couldn't hear their words, she noted the tension in Matthew's shoulders and the sheriff's grave expression. When Matthew returned, his face was carefully composed. We should head back to the ranch, he said. Sheriff Daniels informs me there's been trouble with cattle rustlers to the north. Best to check our herds. The ride back to Willow Creek was quiet, the earlier camaraderie replaced by Matthew's preoccupation with the sheriff's news. Emma used the opportunity to study the land more carefully, noting landmarks and the path they traveled. As they crested a hill, Matthew suddenly pulled the buggy to a halt. There, he said, pointing to a deep ravine that cut across the landscape. Serpent Ravine, it's where Judge Lawrence died. Emma's breath caught in her throat. Why would he show her this place, knowing its connection to a death he had supposedly barely noted? It doesn't look particularly dangerous from here, she observed carefully. It's deceptive, Matthew replied, his voice distant. The sides are steeper than they appear, and there are loose rocks. An inexperienced rider, unfamiliar with the terrain, might easily lose control. The implication was clear. Her father's death could have been an accident, but Emma knew better. Her father had been an excellent horseman, and his journal entries indicated he suspected the Wilsons meant him harm. "Have you lost many cattle there?" she asked, maintaining her innocent facade. "Some," Matthew admitted, "and other things too valuable to replace." There was something in his tone, a heaviness, perhaps even remorse, that Emma hadn't expected. For a brief moment, she wondered if there might be more to the story of her father's death than she and her sisters had pieced together from his journals. But then Matthew flicked the reins, and the buggy moved forward, leaving Serpent Ravine behind. Whatever insights he might have offered remained unspoken. Back at the ranch, they found James and Rebecca on the porch, engaged in what appeared to be a pleasant conversation. James was actually smiling, a sight Emma hadn't yet witnessed, while Rebecca looked genuinely interested in whatever he was describing. "Ah, the prodigal's return," James called as they approached. "Found anything interesting in town?" "The schoolhouse needs work," Matthew replied, helping Emma down from the buggy. "And Sheriff Daniels reports rustlers operating north of here." James's smile faded. "Hawkins again?" "Likely." Matthew's tone suggested this was an ongoing problem. "We'll discuss it later." Emma exchanged a quick glance with Rebecca as the brothers moved away to confer privately. "You seem to be making progress with James," she murmured. "He's not what I expected," Rebecca admitted quietly. "He was showing me the rose bushes he planted last year. Said they reminded him of his mother's garden in Missouri." Emma frowned slightly. "Don't lose sight of why we're here, Rebecca." "I haven't," her sister assured her. "But shouldn't we gather all the information we can, including what kind of men they truly are?" Before Emma could respond, Thomas and Charlotte appeared around the corner of the house, engaged in what appeared to be a heated debate. "It's inefficient," Charlotte was saying, her cheeks flushed with animation. "The eastern pasture has better water access. Moving the pregnant cows there would save time and reduce stress on the animals." "And leave them exposed to predators," Thomas countered gruffly, though he didn't seem angry at her contradiction. "Wolves come down from those hills regularly." "Then build a better fence," Charlotte retorted. "It would still be more efficient than your current arrangement." Thomas spotted his brothers and the other sisters watching them and fell silent, his expression closing off. Charlotte, however, nodded briskly to her sisters, seemingly unperturbed by the audience. "Miss Charlotte has strong opinions about cattle management," Thomas said to Matthew, his tone unreadable. "And you have inefficient methods," Charlotte replied promptly. "But your horses are magnificent. The breeding program shows real intelligence." Thomas's mouth twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "Horses are easier to reason with than cattle or women." Charlotte raised an eyebrow. "Perhaps you simply haven't met the right women, Mr. Wilson." The dynamic between them was unexpected, challenging rather than conciliatory, yet without true hostility. Emma filed this observation away alongside Rebecca's apparent rapport with James. The Wilson brothers were revealing themselves to be more complex than the villains of their imagination. That evening, after dinner, the group gathered in the main room of the ranch house. A fire crackled in the large stone fireplace, warding off the spring chill. Mrs. Hollister had retired to her quarters, leaving the 4 brothers and 4 sisters to become better acquainted. Matthew suggested music, and to Emma's surprise, Andrew moved to the piano and began to play quite skillfully. The strains of a Chopin nocturne filled the room, creating an atmosphere of culture that seemed at odds with the frontier setting. "Our mother insisted we learn," James explained, noting Emma's surprised expression. "Said civilization required more than just survival skills." "She sounds like a wise woman," Rebecca commented. "She was," Matthew agreed, a softness entering, his voice that Emma hadn't heard before. "She'd be pleased to see what we've built here." "And that you've finally sought proper wives," James added, with a hint of teasing. "Though I doubt she envisioned mail-order brides for her sons." "Times change," Matthew replied. "Adaptations must be made." As the evening progressed, Emma was struck by the domesticity of the scene. 4 couples engaged in polite conversation, music playing, a fire warming the room. If not for the knowledge of who these men truly were, it might have been a pleasant gathering. The contradiction troubled her. Later, when the sisters gathered again in their room for a whispered conference, they compared the day's discoveries. The town's records office was conveniently closed, Elizabeth reported, but I overheard conversations at the bank. The Wilsons are respected but not entirely trusted. There are rumors about how they acquired their land, particularly the eastern section. That would be the land father intended for the courthouse, Emma noted. Charlotte nodded. And I found something interesting while walking the property with Thomas. There's a small cabin behind the main house that's kept locked. When I asked about it, he changed the subject immediately. "What do you think is inside?" Rebecca asked. "I don't know," Charlotte admitted, but Thomas's reaction was telling. Whatever it is, they don't want us to see it. Emma considered this information. If there's evidence of father's murder, it might be there. Or in that metal box under the bed, Elizabeth reminded them. We need to find a way to open it without being discovered. Rebecca had been unusually quiet. Finally, she spoke. "James mentioned something today about a tragedy that changed his brother. He said Matthew hasn't been the same since what happened at Serpent Ravine." His exact words. Emma's heart quickened. "Did he elaborate?" "No," Rebecca said. He realized he'd said too much and changed the subject. The pieces were beginning to form a pattern, though still incomplete. The Wilson brothers were hiding something about Judge Lawrence's death, something that continued to haunt them 5 years later. We need to gain their trust, Emma decided. Play our roles perfectly, make them believe we're exactly who we claim to be. "And then," Charlotte prompted, "and then we find the truth," Emma replied firmly. "If they murdered father, as we believe, we'll find proof, and they'll face justice for what they've done." What Emma didn't voice was the growing unease she felt, not about their purpose, but about the complications of achieving it. The Wilson brothers were revealing themselves to be more than the one-dimensional villains she had imagined during those years of planning in Boston. They were men with histories, with virtues alongside their suspected crimes, with humanity that made the sisters' task more complex than they had anticipated. As the first week at Willow Creek Ranch drew to a close, this complexity only increased. Rebecca found herself genuinely enjoying James's company as he showed her the library he had built, book by book, through mail orders to St. Louis and Chicago. Charlotte and Thomas continued their spirited debates about ranch management, developing a grudging mutual respect. Elizabeth's quiet competence at the bank earned her the admiration of the townspeople and increasingly of Andrew Wilson, and Emma found herself studying Matthew with growing confusion. The man who had supposedly orchestrated her father's murder was also the man who read Shakespeare by lamplight, who had built a school for the community's children, who treated his brothers and his ranch hands with firm but genuine concern. On the 7th day, as Emma stood on the porch, watching a storm roll in across the prairie, Matthew joined her, offering a shawl against the cooling air. "Penny for your thoughts, Miss Miller," he said, his voice quiet beneath the growing rumble of thunder. Emma accepted the shawl, wrapping it around her shoulders. "I was thinking about appearances, Mr. Wilson. How deceiving they can be." Matthew studied her face for a moment. "Indeed they can. People are rarely what they seem at first glance." "And what do you see when you look at me?" Emma asked boldly, turning to face him directly. The question seemed to catch him off guard. He considered it seriously before answering. "I see a woman who is more than she claims to be, who carries secrets and perhaps sorrows." He paused. "But also strength, considerable strength." The accuracy of his assessment was unsettling. Emma forced a small smile. You're quite perceptive, Mr. Wilson. Necessity, he replied simply. Out here, misreading people can be fatal. The first heavy drops of rain began to fall, drumming on the porch roof above them. In the distance, lightning split the darkening sky. There's a storm coming, Matthew observed, though his eyes remained on Emma's face. Yes, she agreed, meeting his gaze steadily. I believe there is. Neither of them was speaking only of the weather, and they both knew it. The game of secrets and half-truths was becoming more dangerous with each passing day. And like the approaching storm, the confrontation between the Lawrence sisters and the Wilson brothers was inevitable, building in power and drawing ever closer. The spring storm unleashed its fury across Willow Creek Ranch, transforming the peaceful prairie into a chaotic battlefield of wind and rain. Inside the ranch house, lamps were lit against the premature darkness, casting warm pools of light that belied the tension in the air. Emma stood at the window watching water sluice down the glass, distorting her view of the ranch yard where men worked frantically to secure livestock and equipment. Matthew had joined his brothers outside minutes after their conversation on the porch, disappearing into the deluge without hesitation. The four sisters gathered in the main room, finally able to speak more freely with Mrs. Hollister busy in the kitchen and the brothers absent. We've been here nearly a week, Charlotte said, pacing before the fire, yet we're no closer to finding proof of Father's murder. Rebecca, seated in an armchair with her embroidery, looked up. I disagree. We've learned a great deal about the Wilson brothers and this place. Knowledge isn't proof, Charlotte countered. We need something tangible, something that would stand up in a court of law. Elizabeth, who had been quietly leafing through a book of local history she'd borrowed from the bank manager, closed it with a soft thud. The bank's ledgers show that the Wilson brothers purchased 3,000 acres of prime grazing land 5 years ago, exactly when Father died. Land that had previously been designated for the territorial courthouse. Emma turned from the window. So they benefited directly from his death. Financially, yes, Elizabeth confirmed, but there's something else. The purchase was made the day after Father's body was found. The sisters exchanged significant glances. The timeline supported their suspicions. Judge Lawrence's death had immediately preceded the Wilson brothers' acquisition of valuable property. We need to get into that locked cabin, Emma decided, and we need to open that metal box under the bed. The sudden crash of the front door opening interrupted their conference. The Wilson brothers entered in a rush of cold air and rain, their clothes soaked and mud-splattered. The creek's rising, Matthew announced, removing his dripping hat. We need to move the cattle from the lower pasture before it floods. His gaze swept the room, taking in the four sisters huddled by the fire, and something in his expression suggested he sensed the abrupt change in conversation upon their entrance. All hands required? James asked, already removing his sodden coat. Yes, Matthew confirmed. Thomas, get the men from the bunkhouse. Andrew, check the stable. We'll need every horse that can work. We can help, Charlotte said suddenly, rising to her feet. The brothers turned to her in surprise. Matthew shook his head. This isn't ladies' work, Miss Charlotte. It's dangerous in these conditions. I can ride as well as any man, Charlotte insisted, and Rebecca and Emma are both capable horsewomen. We'd be more useful helping than sitting here waiting. Thomas looked skeptical. Have you ever herded cattle in a thunderstorm, Miss Charlotte? No, she admitted, but I learn quickly, and you need every rider available. A flash of lightning illuminated the room, followed immediately by a crack of thunder that rattled the windows. The storm was directly overhead now, and time was running short. After a brief hesitation, Matthew nodded. Very well. Change into something practical if you have it. Trousers would be best, though I realize ladies may not. We came prepared, "Oh, for frontier life, Mr. Wilson," Emma interrupted. "We have suitable clothing." The brothers exchanged surprised glances as the sisters hurried upstairs to change. Within minutes, they returned wearing split skirts designed for riding, a scandal in Boston drawing rooms, but entirely practical for the task at hand. "Well then," Matthew said, with newfound respect in his voice, "let's ride." The storm's fury had intensified, turning the ranch yard into a quagmire of mud and standing water. Ranch hands were already mounted, waiting for instructions. Mrs. Hollister appeared with oilskin slickers for everyone, her expression concerned but resigned to the necessity of the sisters' participation. "Be careful," she warned as she helped Emma don the heavy coat. "The creek floods quickly in this part of the valley." "We will," Emma assured her, accepting a pair of leather gloves. The next hours passed in a blur of rain and exertion. Emma found herself riding alongside Matthew, helping to guide frightened cattle away from the rapidly rising creek. The work was demanding, requiring concentration and physical stamina unlike anything she had experienced in her sheltered Boston life. The cattle were reluctant to move in the storm, confused by the driving rain and spooked by thunder. Several times, Matthew had to intervene when steers threatened to bolt in the wrong direction, his commands to both cattle and riders clear despite the howling wind. Emma was impressed, despite herself. The Wilson brothers worked with practiced efficiency, communicating through gestures when voices couldn't carry through the storm. Even Andrew, the youngest, showed remarkable skill in anticipating problems and responding quickly. The water continued to rise, turning the creek into a churning brown torrent that ate away at its banks with frightening speed. Emma found herself guiding her horse through water that reached above the animal's knees, feeling the powerful current threatening her balance. "Stay close!" Matthew shouted over the storm, guiding his own mount beside hers. "The footing is treacherous." "Here!" As if to prove his point, Emma's horse suddenly stumbled, nearly throwing her. Matthew's hand shot out, grabbing her arm and steadying her until the horse regained its footing. "Thank you," she gasped, heart racing from the near fall. Matthew's eyes met hers, rain streaming down his face. "I shouldn't have let you come. This is too dangerous." "I'm fine," Emma insisted, though her hands trembled on the reins. "We need to finish moving the herd." A shout from across the field drew their attention. Thomas was waving frantically, pointing downstream where the current had caught several calves, sweeping them toward a bend in the creek where fallen trees created a deadly strainer. Without hesitation, Matthew spurred his horse toward the danger, calling for James to follow. Emma watched in horror as both men guided their mounts directly into the surging water, reaching for the struggling calves. "They'll be killed," she murmured, fear gripping her chest. Charlotte appeared beside her, her face grim beneath her sodden hat. "Not if I can help it," she said, and before Emma could stop her, she too was riding toward the creek. What followed was a desperate rescue operation. The Wilson brothers managed to grab 2 calves, lifting them onto their horses, while Charlotte maneuvered her mount to block others from being swept downstream. Ranch hands formed a living barrier, guiding the remaining cattle to higher ground. Emma found herself working alongside Andrew, the youngest Wilson. Despite his age, he displayed remarkable calm, issuing clear instructions to the ranch hands while keeping a protective eye on both his brothers and Charlotte. "Your sister is either very brave or very foolish," he commented as they watched Charlotte wade her horse deeper into the current. "Sometimes it's difficult to distinguish between the two," Emma replied truthfully. Andrew's face, usually guarded, showed genuine concern. "If anything happens to her, Thomas will..." He stopped abruptly. "Thomas will what?" Emma pressed, intrigued by his slip. Andrew shook his head. "Nothing. We should join the others." By the time the last of the cattle reached safety on higher ground, the storm was beginning to abate. The rain lessened to a steady drizzle, and the thunder moved eastward, rumbling in the distance. Exhausted riders gathered to take stock of their losses. 3 calves drowned, but the majority of the herd saved. Matthew approached Emma, who sat astride her horse watching the now receding creek. His expression was unreadable through the mud and rain that streaked his face. "You handled yourself well," he said simply. "As did your brothers," Emma acknowledged. "And Charlotte." Matthew nodded, glancing to where Charlotte and Thomas were dismounting, their conversation animated despite their exhaustion. "Your sister has spirit and skill." "We all do," Emma replied. "Perhaps more than you anticipated from mail-order brides." Something flickered in Matthew's eyes. Curiosity, perhaps, or suspicion. "Indeed, you Miller sisters continue to surprise." The ride back to the ranch was quieter. The immediate danger passed, but the exertion of the rescue taking its toll. Mrs. Hollister met them at the door with towels and hot coffee, clicking her tongue at their bedraggled state, but clearly relieved. At their safe return, "Baths for everyone," she announced. "I've had the men heating water since you left. Ladies first, then the gentlemen." The luxury of hot water was welcome beyond words. Emma sank into the copper tub in their room, letting the warmth seep into her aching muscles. Rebecca joined her shortly, her own bath complete, and began to brush out her wet hair. "Thomas saved Charlotte's life," Rebecca said quietly. "Her horse lost its footing in the current, and she nearly went under. He reached her just in time." Emma sat up straighter. "Is she all right?" "Shaken but unharmed." Rebecca's brush paused. She thanked him, and he just nodded and said, "Now we're even." I don't know what he meant by that. Charlotte and Elizabeth entered before Emma could respond. Charlotte's usual confidence seemed subdued, her movements careful, as though she were sore. "You should have seen it," Elizabeth told Emma. "Thomas rode straight into the deepest part of the creek to reach her. It was heroic." Charlotte snorted, though without her usual bite. "It was necessary. I would have done the same for him." "And that," Emma noted, "is precisely what complicates our situation." The sisters fell silent, each contemplating the implications of the day's events. They had come to Willow Creek Ranch seeking justice for their father's murder, only to find themselves indebted to the very men they suspected of the crime. "This changes nothing," Charlotte finally said, though her voice lacked conviction. "If they killed father, they must answer for it, regardless of today." "Of course," Emma agreed. "But we must be certain, absolutely certain." Later that evening, after changing into dry clothes, the sisters joined the Wilson brothers for a simple meal in the kitchen, the formality of the dining room abandoned in favor of the hearth's warmth. Mrs. Hollister served soup and fresh bread, the comfort of hot food welcome after the day's ordeal. Conversation was minimal, exhaustion evident in every face. Yet there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a shared experience that had altered the dynamic between the two families. The brothers were less guarded, the sisters less formal. 3 calves lost, Thomas reported between spoonfuls of soup. "Could have been worse." "Much worse," James agreed, "if not for quick action." His gaze moved to Charlotte briefly before returning to his bowl. Andrew, seated beside Elizabeth, spoke.
"Up."
"Miss Elizabeth, would you still be willing to visit the bank tomorrow? Mr. Pearson will understand if you need to rest after today." Elizabeth smiled slightly. "I'm perfectly capable of reviewing ledgers, Mr. Andrew. A little rain won't deter me." "A little rain," Matthew echoed with a rare chuckle. "Is that what you call it back east?" The gentle teasing continued throughout the meal, creating an almost comfortable camaraderie that Emma found increasingly disorienting. These men had shown courage, competence, and even kindness, qualities that made their suspected crime more difficult to reconcile. After dinner, while the brothers retreated to discuss ranch business, Emma found an opportunity she had been waiting for. With Rebecca engaging Mrs. Hollister in conversation about preserving techniques, and Charlotte and Elizabeth occupied with mending torn clothing from the day's activities, Emma slipped upstairs alone. The metal box remained hidden beneath the bed where Elizabeth had discovered it. Emma retrieved it carefully, examining the lock. It was a simple mechanism that might yield to the hairpin she had prepared for this purpose. After several tense minutes of manipulation, she heard a satisfying click. Heart-pounding, Emma opened the box. Inside lay several folded documents, a small leather pouch, and a journal bound in dark brown leather. Her hands trembled as she lifted the journal, recognizing it immediately, not by appearance, but by the initials embossed on the cover. J.L., Judge Lawrence, her father. This was his missing journal, the final volume that had not been returned with his effects. Emma had long suspected that this journal might contain evidence of threats or confrontations with the Wilson brothers immediately preceding his death. With shaking fingers, she opened it to the final entries. Scanning quickly for mentions of the Wilsons, she found reference to a meeting 2 days before his death. Met with Matthew Wilson regarding land sale. He proposes partnership in cattle, operation instead of courthouse construction. Explained my position as judicial appointee precludes such arrangements. Discussion grew heated when I revealed plans for establishing permanent legal presence in territory. Wilson claims existing landholders have managed well enough without courts or eastern interference. Suspect deeper concerns behind his objections. Emma turned the page, finding the entry from the day before her father died. Confrontation with Wilson brothers at proposed courthouse site. Matthew Wilson presented documents claiming prior purchase of land. Papers appear irregular, possible forgery. Informed him I would investigate legality of claim upon return to St. Louis. James Wilson made veiled threat regarding accidents befalling troublesome outsiders. Will expedite departure tomorrow after collecting final surveys. The final entry was brief, written late the same night. Strange riders observed near camp after dark. Taking precautions. Sending copies of all documents with Clark on morning stage. If anything happens, investigation should focus on Wilson land claims. Emma's blood ran cold. Here was the evidence they had sought, a clear record of threats. From the Wilson brothers, followed immediately by her father's death. The journal confirmed their suspicions and justified their quest for justice. As she carefully returned the journal to the box, intending to show her sisters later when they could speak privately, Emma noticed another document partially concealed beneath the leather pouch. She extracted it carefully, unfolding what appeared to be a letter written in a different hand than her father's. The letter was addressed to Matthew Wilson and signed by a Marshal Thornton. It described an investigation into Judge Lawrence's death, conducted privately at Matthew's request shortly after the official ruling of accidental death. The contents made Emma's hands shake. Regarding your inquiry into the death of Judge Lawrence, I have interviewed all witnesses discreetly as requested. Evidence suggests presence of third party at ravine, boot prints inconsistent with Judge's or any Wilson footwear. Partial horse tracks indicate rider approached from north, not from direction of Wilson property or town. Empty cartridge casing found approximately 50 yards from site of fall. Cannot conclusively state murder occurred, but circumstances warrant further investigation. As you requested, I have not shared these findings with territorial authorities. Pending your instructions, recommend caution in pursuing this matter given land dispute complications and your family's history with deceased. Emma read the letter twice, struggling to make sense of it. Why would Matthew Wilson commission a private investigation into her father's death if he had been responsible for it? And why keep the findings secret all these years? The sound of footsteps in the hallway gave her barely enough time to refold the documents and return the box to its hiding place. The door opened to reveal Rebecca, who looked surprised to find Emma alone in the room. "There you are," Rebecca said. "Mrs. Hollister was asking if you wanted tea before retiring." "Yes, thank you," Emma replied, hoping her voice sounded normal, despite her racing thoughts. "I'll be down shortly." After Rebecca departed, Emma sat on the edge of the bed, her mind whirling with new questions. The journal entries confirmed threats from the Wilson brothers, yet the letter suggested Matthew had sought the truth about her father's death. The contradiction made no sense, unless there was more to the story than the sisters had imagined. When she finally joined the others downstairs, Emma found it difficult to maintain her composure. Matthew sat by the fire reading, occasionally making notes in the margin of his book. How could this scholarly figure be the same man who had threatened her father days before his death? And if he had arranged the murder, why commission an investigation afterward? "Miss Emma," Matthew said, looking up as she entered, "I trust you're recovered from today's excitement." "Yes, thank you," she replied, accepting tea from Mrs. Hollister. "Though I suspect I'll feel the effects tomorrow." Matthew nodded sympathetically. The first cattle drive is always the hardest, though few include such dramatic conditions. "You and your brothers handled the situation admirably," Emma said, watching his face carefully for any reaction. "You seem accustomed to facing unexpected dangers." "The frontier teaches preparedness," he replied simply, "and quick decisions. Like purchasing new land when opportunity presents itself," Emma ventured, the words escaping before she could. "Reconsider." Something flickered in Matthew's eyes. Wariness, perhaps. "Sometimes," he agreed cautiously, "though hasty decisions often lead to regret." The loaded statement hung between them. Emma wondered if he was referring to her father's death, to the land purchase that followed, or to something else entirely. The next morning dawned clear and cool, the storm having cleansed the air and left the prairie glistening with moisture. Emma rose early, her sleep having been troubled by dreams of her father and the confusing evidence she had discovered. She found Matthew on the porch, coffee in hand, surveying the ranch as the sun's first rays touched the buildings. "You're up early," he commented as she joined him. "As are you," she replied, "though I suspect you're always the first awake." He nodded. "Habit formed during the war, never quite broke it." "The war shaped you significantly," Emma observed. "You and James especially." "It changes everyone who survives it," Matthew agreed. "Makes some men better, some worse, some just different." Emma studied his profile in the early light. "And which were you, Mr. Wilson?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. He considered it seriously before answering. "Different, I suppose. Learned the value of life and the cost of taking it." The statement sent a chill through Emma, despite the warming day. Was this an oblique confession or something else entirely? Before she could pursue the thought, commotion from the direction of the bunkhouse drew their attention. A rider was approaching at speed, one of the ranch hands returning from an early patrol. He reined in sharply before the porch, his horse lathered despite the cool morning. "Mr. Wilson," he called urgently. "Trouble at the north boundary. Fence cut in 3 places and about 30 head missing." Matthew's expression hardened instantly. "Rustlers?" "Yes, sir. Tracks head towards Serpent Ravine. Looks like Hawkins' work, same as last month." "Get James and Thomas," Matthew ordered, already moving toward the stables. "We ride in 10 minutes." The ranch hand galloped toward the bunkhouse as Matthew turned to Emma. "Please inform Mrs. Hollister we'll be gone most of the day. This requires immediate attention." Emma nodded, watching as he strode purposefully across the yard. Within minutes, the ranch erupted into organized activity as men prepared to pursue the cattle thieves. The Wilson brothers appeared fully armed, their expressions grim as they mounted their horses. "Be careful," Emma called to Matthew, the words emerging unbidden. He looked back at her, something unreadable in his eyes. "Always," he replied before spurring his horse forward. As the riders disappeared in a cloud of dust, Emma returned to the house to find her sisters gathered in the kitchen with Mrs. Hollister, who was packing food into saddlebags. "Rustlers again?" the housekeeper explained. Her movements efficient, but her expression worried. "Third time this spring?" "Who is Hawkins?" Emma asked, recalling the name from the ranch hand's report. Mrs. Hollister's face darkened. "Jed Hawkins. Runs a gang that's been plaguing ranches in these parts for years. Started small, a few head here and there. Now they're bolder, taking more each time. Why haven't they been arrested?" Rebecca wondered. "No proof," Mrs. Hollister replied grimly. "And no witnesses that live long enough to testify. 2 ranchers who tried to bring charges were found. Dead last year, same ravine where that judge died 5 years back." Emma and her sisters exchanged significant glances at this revelation. "Serpent Ravine seems to have a deadly history," Charlotte observed carefully. "Some say it's cursed," Mrs. Hollister agreed, sealing the last of the food packages, "though I put more stock in human malice than supernatural forces." Elizabeth, who had been quiet, suddenly spoke. "Do the Wilson brothers have history with this Hawkins person?" Mrs. Hollister hesitated, her hands stilling briefly. "You could say that. Hawkins used to ride for the Wilsons when they first established the ranch. Matthew caught him stealing and dismissed him. Hawkins swore revenge, said he'd take everything the Wilsons built, piece by piece." This was new information that cast the situation in yet another light. If Hawkins had a vendetta against the Wilson brothers, could he have been involved in Judge Lawrence's death? The letter Emma had found mentioned a third party at the ravine, someone not connected to the Wilsons. "When did this happen with Hawkins?" Emma asked casually. "About 5 years ago," Mrs. Hollister replied, confirming Emma's suspicions. "Right around the time of all that courthouse business and the judge's accident. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence." Emma exchanged a meaningful look with her sisters, seeing her own thoughts reflected in their eyes. The simple narrative they had constructed in Boston of the Wilson brothers murdering their father to obtain his land was becoming more complex with each new revelation. "Andrew remained behind," Charlotte noted, changing the subject slightly. "Is he not part of these pursuits?" Mrs. Hollister shook her head. "Matthew's orders, always someone stays to protect the ranch, usually Andrew being the youngest. As if summoned by the mention of his name, Andrew appeared in the doorway, rifle in hand. "I'll be patrolling the perimeter today," he informed them. "Best if you ladies stay close to the house until my brothers return." His tone was polite but firm, not a suggestion but an order. Emma nodded agreement, sensing an opportunity in the brothers' absence. "Of course, Mr. Andrew, we understand the precaution." Once Andrew had departed, Emma gathered her sisters in the sitting room, well away from Mrs. Hollister's keen ears. "I found something last night," she whispered, quickly relating her discovery of their father's journal and the mysterious letter indicating Matthew Wilson had commissioned an investigation into his death. "That makes no sense," Charlotte hissed. "Why investigate a murder you committed?" "Unless he didn't commit it," Rebecca suggested quietly. The possibility hung in the air between them. It was Elizabeth who finally gave voice to the thought they all were considering. "What if we've been wrong all these years?" she asked. "What if the Wilson brothers didn't kill father?" "The journal entries confirm they threatened him," Emma reminded them, "and they benefited directly from his death. Threats aren't proof of murder," Rebecca countered. "And if this Hawkins person had a grudge against both the Wilsons and anyone connected to law enforcement..." Emma nodded slowly. "It creates another possibility, but we need more information." "The locked cabin," Charlotte suggested. "With the men gone and only Andrew patrolling, this might be our chance to investigate." The sisters agreed, devising a plan to distract both Andrew and Mrs. Hollister. Rebecca would engage the housekeeper with questions about preserving vegetables. while Elizabeth would ask Andrew to check a supposedly loose board on the stable roof, visible from the main house, but far enough to give Charlotte and Emma time to examine the locked cabin. The plan worked perfectly. While Andrew balanced precariously on the stable roof and Mrs. Hollister explained the finer points of pickling to a fascinated Rebecca, Emma and Charlotte slipped behind the main house to the small cabin that had drawn their attention earlier. The lock was substantial, but yielded to the same hairpin technique Emma had used on the metal box. With a final glance to ensure they remained unobserved, the sisters entered the cabin and closed the door behind them. What they found inside was entirely unexpected. The cabin's interior was bathed in dusty light, filtering through small windows. Emma and Charlotte stood frozen in the doorway, taking in the unexpected scene before them. Instead of evidence of crime or ill-gotten gains, they found a shrine to memory. The single room was meticulously arranged with furniture that seemed out of place in the frontier setting. A lady's writing desk of polished cherry, a delicate chair with needlepoint cushions, and bookshelves lined with leather-bound volumes. "It's a woman's study," Charlotte whispered, moving deeper into the room. Emma followed, noticing the framed portraits on the walls, a handsome couple on their wedding day, 4 young boys of varying ages arranged formally, and finally a middle-aged woman with a gentle smile and Matthew Wilson's piercing eyes. Their mother, Emma realized, touching the frame lightly. They've preserved her things. Charlotte was examining the writing desk, which held a silver inkwell and several bound journals. "Emma, look at this." She held up one of the journals, open to an entry dated 6 years earlier. The handwriting was elegant, feminine, clearly not belonging to any of the Wilson brothers. "Margaret Wilson," Emma read from the signature at the bottom of the page. "Their mother kept journals too." Charlotte nodded. "And look at this entry. It mentions Judge Lawrence." Emma took the journal, scanning the passage. April 12th, 1872. Judge Lawrence arrived from St. Louis today, representing the territorial government. He speaks of building a courthouse and bringing formal law to our community. Matthew is skeptical, fearing Eastern interference in our affairs, but I reminded him that civilization requires governance. The judge seems a reasonable man, educated and fair-minded. He reminds me somewhat of my late husband in his dedication to principle. I've invited him to dine with us tomorrow, hoping Matthew will see the benefit of cooperation rather than resistance. Emma turned the page, finding another entry. April 13th, 1872. Judge Lawrence dined with us as planned. The evening began cordially enough, with the judge explaining his vision for territorial development. Matthew listened respectfully until the matter of land acquisition arose. The judge has identified our east section as ideal for the courthouse, citing its central location and proximity to the creek. This land has special significance to our family. It contains Henry's grave and the first cabin we built upon arriving. Matthew explained this, but the judge, while sympathetic, indicated the territorial government has authority to claim the land through legal means, if necessary. The conversation grew tense after that. I fear Matthew sees the judge as a threat. To all we've built here, the discovery was astonishing. Their father had first visited Cedar Ridge a full year before his death, meeting with the Wilson family and specifically identifying land with personal significance for his courthouse site. "This changes things," Charlotte murmured, picking up another journal. "Listen to this entry from later that year," she read aloud. October 8th, 1872. Matthew's feud with Judge Lawrence continues to trouble me. While I understand his desire to protect our land, his methods concern me. Yesterday I overheard him discussing strategies with James to discourage the courthouse project. When I questioned him, he assured me nothing illegal was planned, merely legal obstacles and community persuasion. I pray he remembers his father's teachings about honor, even in adversarial situations. Emma shook her head, struggling to reconcile these new insights with their long-held beliefs. She was concerned about their methods, but this doesn't prove they murdered father. No, Charlotte agreed, but it establishes a history between the Wilsons and father that's more complex than we realized. They continued searching the room, finding more journals spanning the years of Margaret Wilson's life on the frontier. Emma located the final volume, noting with a pang that the entries ended abruptly in early 1873, just months before Judge Lawrence's second visit and subsequent death. The last entry was brief. January 15th, 1873, the cough worsens despite Dr. Miller's treatments. I have instructed Matthew to send for the specialist in St. Louis, though I fear it may be too late. My greatest concern is not for myself, but for my sons when I am gone. Matthew carries too much responsibility. James masks his grief with indifference. Thomas retreats into silence, and young Andrew, my gentle boy, feels everything too deeply. I pray they will hold to the values their father and I taught them, even in my absence. She died, Emma said softly, just months before father returned, which means he was dealing with grieving sons, not just business competitors, Charlotte added, her expression troubled. A sound outside startled them, footsteps approaching the cabin. Hastily, Emma replaced the journal where they'd found it, while Charlotte moved to the window, peering cautiously through the dusty glass. "It's Andrew," she whispered urgently. "He's coming this way." They had no time to escape undetected. Instead, Emma made a split-second decision. "Follow my lead," she instructed, moving to sit at Margaret Wilson's desk as though she belonged there. When Andrew opened the door moments later, he found Emma seated at his mother's writing desk and Charlotte examining a bookshelf, both women appearing perfectly at ease despite their unauthorized presence. His face registered shock, then anger. "What are you doing in here?" he demanded, his usually gentle demeanor hardening. "This place is private." Emma rose smoothly, meeting his gaze with calm she didn't feel. "Forgive our intrusion, Mr. Andrew. Mrs. Hollister mentioned your mother was a great reader and writer. When we discovered this cabin, we couldn't resist exploring." Andrew's expression remained suspicious. "This door was locked." "Was it?" Emma replied innocently. "It was ajar when we passed by. Perhaps the storm damaged the lock." Charlotte joined them, her face composed despite the tension. "Your mother had exquisite taste in literature. Shakespeare, Austen, even some Walter Scott. She must have been a remarkable woman." Andrew's anger faltered, replaced by a complicated mix of emotions. "She was," he said softly. "This was her sanctuary. After she died, Matthew preserved it exactly as she left it." "That shows great respect," Emma observed, watching him carefully. "You must miss her terribly." Something in Andrew's expression shifted. "Every day," he admitted, "especially Matthew. He promised her he'd hold the family together, keep the ranch going. It's why he stopped abruptly. "Why he what?" Emma prompted gently. Andrew shook his head. "Nothing, but you shouldn't be here. Matthew doesn't like anyone disturbing Mother's things." "We understand," Emma assured him, moving toward the door. "We meant no disrespect." As they left the cabin, Emma noticed Andrew locking it securely behind them, testing the door to ensure it was properly secured. His protective behavior toward his mother's sanctuary revealed yet another dimension to the Wilson brothers, one that humanized them further. Back in the main house, Emma and Charlotte rejoined their sisters, sharing their discoveries in hurried whispers while Mrs. Hollister was occupied elsewhere. "So their mother knew father," Rebecca summarized, "and died shortly before his second visit when he was killed." Elizabeth frowned thoughtfully. "And the land he wanted for the courthouse had special significance to the Wilson family." "Including their father's grave," Charlotte added. Emma located the final volume, noting with a pang that the entries ended abruptly in early 1873, just months before Judge Lawrence's second visit and subsequent death. The last entry was brief. January 15th, 1873, the cough worsens despite Dr. Miller's treatments. I have instructed Matthew to send for the specialist in St. Louis, though I fear it may be too late. My greatest concern is not for myself, but for my sons when I am gone. Matthew carries too much responsibility. James masks his grief with indifference. Thomas retreats into silence, and young Andrew, my gentle boy, feels everything too deeply. I pray they will hold to the values their father and I taught them, even in my absence. She died, Emma said softly, just months before father returned, which means he was dealing with grieving sons, not just business competitors, Charlotte added, her expression troubled. A sound outside startled them, footsteps approaching the cabin. Hastily, Emma replaced the journal where they'd found it, while Charlotte moved to the window, peering cautiously through the dusty glass. "It's Andrew," she whispered urgently. "He's coming this way." They had no time to escape undetected. Instead, Emma made a split-second decision. "Follow my lead," she instructed, moving to sit at Margaret Wilson's desk as though she belonged there. When Andrew opened the door moments later, he found Emma seated at his mother's writing desk and Charlotte examining a bookshelf, both women appearing perfectly at ease despite their unauthorized presence. His face registered shock, then anger. "What are you doing in here?" he demanded, his usually gentle demeanor hardening. "This place is private." Emma rose smoothly, meeting his gaze with calm she didn't feel. "Forgive our intrusion, Mr. Andrew. Mrs. Hollister mentioned your mother was a great reader and writer. When we discovered this cabin, we couldn't resist exploring." Andrew's expression remained suspicious. "This door was locked." "Was it?" Emma replied innocently. "It was ajar when we passed by. Perhaps the storm damaged the lock." Charlotte joined them, her face composed despite the tension. "Your mother had exquisite taste in literature. Shakespeare, Austen, even some Walter Scott. She must have been a remarkable woman." Andrew's anger faltered, replaced by a complicated mix of emotions. "She was," he said softly. "This was her sanctuary. After she died, Matthew preserved it exactly as she left it." "That shows great respect," Emma observed, watching him carefully. "You must miss her terribly." Something in Andrew's expression shifted. "Every day," he admitted, "especially Matthew. He promised her he'd hold the family together, keep the ranch going. It's why he stopped abruptly. "Why he what?" Emma prompted gently. Andrew shook his head. "Nothing, but you shouldn't. Be here. Matthew doesn't like anyone disturbing Mother's things." "We understand," Emma assured him, moving toward the door. "We meant no disrespect." As they left the cabin, Emma noticed Andrew locking it securely behind them, testing the door to ensure it was properly secured. His protective behavior toward his mother's sanctuary revealed yet another dimension to the Wilson brothers, one that humanized them further. Back in the main house, Emma and Charlotte rejoined their sisters, sharing their discoveries in hurried whispers while Mrs. Hollister was occupied elsewhere. "So their mother knew father," Rebecca summarized, "and died shortly before his second visit when he was killed." Elizabeth frowned thoughtfully. "And the land he wanted for the courthouse had special significance to the Wilson family." "Including their father's grave," Charlotte added, "which explains their resistance to selling, but still doesn't prove or disprove their involvement in father's death." Emma paced the room, piecing together the fragments of information they'd gathered. "We need to find out more about this Hawkins person. If he was dismissed by the Wilsons around the same time and has a vendetta against them." He could have seen an opportunity in father's conflict with the Wilsons, Rebecca concluded. Kill the judge and let suspicion fall on his former employers. The sound of horses in the yard interrupted their discussion. Moving to the window, Emma saw several riders approaching, but not the Wilson brothers. These men were rough-looking, strangers, their expressions hard beneath dust-covered hats. Andrew appeared from the direction of the stables, rifle in hand. He positioned himself on the porch, a clear warning to the approaching riders. "That's far enough," his voice carried through the open window. "State your business." The lead rider, a weathered man with a scar cutting through his left eyebrow, reined in his horse. "Looking for the Wilson brothers," he called. "Got some unfinished business." "They're not here," Andrew replied steadily. "I'm Andrew Wilson. Any business with my brothers can be conducted through me." The scarred man's laugh held no humor. Right, well, young Wilson, you tell your brothers Jed Hawkins says they're riding into a trap. Those cattle they're chasing? Wait, my boys are waiting at Serpent Ravine to finish what started 5 years ago. Emma's blood ran cold. This was Hawkins, the dismissed ranch hand with a grudge against the Wilsons, and he had just confirmed their suspicions about a connection to their father's death. Andrew's stance remained firm. "Deliver your message and leave, Hawkins. This is Wilson land." "Not for long," Hawkins sneered. "After today, there won't be any Wilsons left to claim it." His gaze drifted to the window where Emma stood watching. "Though I see you've got some pretty company. Mail-order brides we heard in town. Shame they'll be widows before they're even wives." Andrew raised his rifle slightly. "Leave, now." Hawkins and his men retreated, but their threatening presence lingered in the air. The moment they were out of sight, Andrew rushed inside, his face pale. "Mrs. Hollister," he called, "saddle my horse. I need to warn my brothers." The housekeeper appeared from the kitchen, alarm on her face. "What's happened?" "Hawkins," Andrew replied grimly. "It's a trap at Serpent Ravine." Emma stepped forward. "We overheard. Your brothers are in danger." Andrew nodded, already checking his ammunition. "I need to reach them before they ride into the ambush." "You can't go alone," Charlotte protested. "Hawkins had at least 5 men with him, and likely more waiting at the ravine." "I don't have a choice," Andrew insisted. "My brothers would do the same for me." A moment of silent communication passed between the sisters, culminating in Emma's decisive nod. "We're coming with you," she announced. Andrew stared in disbelief. "Absolutely not. It's too dangerous." "We can ride," Charlotte countered, "and between us we have enough experience with firearms to be useful." "This isn't some cattle roundup in the rain," Andrew argued. "These are dangerous men intent on murder." "Men who won't be expecting women," Rebecca pointed out reasonably, "which gives us an advantage." Elizabeth, typically the quietest sister, stepped forward. "The Wilsons aren't the only ones with unfinished business at Serpent Ravine, Mr. Andrew." Something in her tone made Andrew look at her more closely. "What do you mean by that?" Emma intervened before Elizabeth could reveal too much. "She means, we've grown fond of your family these past days. We won't stand by while they ride into danger." Andrew hesitated, clearly torn between his urgent mission and his reluctance to endanger the women, which explains their resistance to selling, but still doesn't prove or disprove their involvement in father's death. Emma paced the room, piecing together the fragments of information they'd gathered. "We need to find out more about this Hawkins person. If he was dismissed by the Wilsons around the same time and has a vendetta against them. He could have seen an opportunity in father's conflict with the Wilsons," Rebecca concluded. "Kill the judge and let suspicion fall on his former employers." The sound of horses in the yard interrupted their discussion. Moving to the window, Emma saw several riders approaching, but not the Wilson brothers. These men were rough-looking, strangers, their expressions hard beneath dust-covered hats. Andrew appeared from the direction of the stables, rifle in hand. He positioned himself on the porch, a clear warning to the approaching riders. "That's far enough," his voice carried through the open window. "State your business." The lead rider, a weathered man with a scar cutting through his left eyebrow, reined in his horse. "Looking for the Wilson brothers," he called. "Got some unfinished business." "They're not here," Andrew replied steadily. "I'm Andrew Wilson. Any business with my brothers can be conducted through me." The scarred man's laugh held no humor. "That, right, well, young Wilson, you tell your brothers Jed Hawkins says they're riding into a trap. Those cattle they're chasing? Wait, my boys are waiting at Serpent Ravine to finish what started 5 years ago." Emma's blood ran cold. This was Hawkins, the dismissed ranch hand with a grudge against the Wilsons, and he had just confirmed their suspicions about a connection to their father's death. Andrew's stance remained firm. "Deliver your message and leave, Hawkins. This is Wilson land." "Not for long," Hawkins sneered. "After today, there won't be any Wilsons left to claim it." His gaze drifted to the window where Emma stood watching. "Though I see you've got some pretty company. Mail-order brides we heard in town. Shame they'll be widows before they're even wives." Andrew raised his rifle slightly. "Leave, now." Hawkins and his men retreated, but their threatening presence lingered in the air. The moment they were out of sight, Andrew rushed inside, his face pale. "Mrs. Hollister," he called, "saddle my horse. I need to warn my brothers." The housekeeper appeared from the kitchen, alarm on her face. "What's happened?" "Hawkins," Andrew replied grimly. "It's a trap at Serpent Ravine." Emma stepped forward. "We overheard. Your brothers are in danger." Andrew nodded, already checking his ammunition. "I need to reach them before they ride into the ambush." "You can't go alone," Charlotte protested. "Hawkins had at least 5 men with him, and likely more waiting at the ravine." "I don't have a choice," Andrew insisted. "My brothers would do the same for me." A moment of silent communication passed between the sisters, culminating in Emma's decisive nod. "We're coming with you," she announced. Andrew stared in disbelief. "Absolutely not. It's too dangerous." "We can ride," Charlotte countered, "and between us we have enough experience with firearms to be useful." "This isn't some cattle roundup in the rain," Andrew argued. "These are dangerous men intent on murder." "Men who won't be expecting women," Rebecca pointed out reasonably, "which gives us an advantage." Elizabeth, typically the quietest sister, stepped forward. "The Wilsons aren't the only ones with unfinished business at Serpent Ravine, Mr. Andrew." Something in her tone made Andrew look at her more closely. "What do you mean by that?" Emma intervened before Elizabeth could reveal too much. "She means we've grown fond of your family these past days. We won't stand by while they ride into danger." Andrew hesitated, clearly torn between his urgent mission and his reluctance to endanger the women. Finally, practicality won out. "Can you all shoot?" All 4 sisters nodded firmly. Their father had insisted his daughters learn to handle firearms despite society's disapproval, a skill that now seemed providential. "Then we ride in 10 minutes, Andrew decided. "Mrs. Hollister will need provisions and extra ammunition." The housekeeper, who had been listening in stunned silence, finally found her voice. "Andrew Wilson, your brother will have my hide if I let you take these ladies into danger." "Then don't tell him I'm taking them," Andrew replied with sudden authority. "Tell him I went alone. The responsibility is mine." Within minutes, 5 horses were saddled, and the unlikely rescue party was underway, racing across the prairie toward Serpent Ravine. Andrew led, setting a pace that tested the sisters' riding abilities but didn't exceed them. Emma was impressed by his leadership. The youngest Wilson brother was revealing depths they hadn't anticipated. As they rode, Andrew, outlined his plan. "We'll approach from the east using the high ground for cover. If we can spot them before they reach the ravine, we can warn them away from the ambush." "And if they're already at the ravine?" Rebecca asked, voicing the concern they all shared. Andrew's expression darkened. "Then we create a distraction, something to even the odds." The journey to Serpent Ravine took nearly an hour at their grueling pace. As they approached, Andrew signaled for them to dismount and proceed on foot, using a line of scrubby trees for cover. From their elevated position, they could see the ravine below, a jagged cut in the earth with steep sides and a narrow floor. "There," Charlotte whispered, pointing to movement along the ravine's edge. "Riders concealed among those rocks." Emma counted at least 7 men positioned strategically around the ravine, rifles ready. It was indeed an ambush, with clear sightlines, to the trail that approached from the direction of Wilson Ranch. "And there," Elizabeth added, indicating a dust cloud in the distance, "that must be your brothers." Andrew's face was grim as he assessed the situation. "We're too late to warn them away. They'll be in the ravine within minutes." "What's your plan?" Emma asked, her heart racing with fear and determination. Andrew considered for a moment, then distributed the rifles and ammunition Mrs. Hollister had provided. "We create confusion. Fire from different positions to make Hawkins and his men think they're surrounded. When my brothers hear the shots, they'll know something's wrong and take cover." It was a dangerous strategy that relied on timing and the element of surprise. The sisters positioned themselves as Andrew directed, spreading out along the ridgeline to create the illusion of greater numbers. "Wait for my signal," Andrew instructed, "and aim for the rocks near the men, not the men themselves unless absolutely necessary. Our goal is to create confusion, not casualties, if we can avoid it." Emma settled behind a boulder, rifle ready, watching as the Wilson brothers and their ranch hands approached the ravine, unaware of the danger awaiting them. She could make out Matthew in the lead, followed closely by James and Thomas. They had no idea they were riding into a trap set by a man who possibly had a hand in her father's death. The irony wasn't lost on her. After years of believing the Wilson brothers responsible for Judge Lawrence's murder, she now found herself fighting to save their lives from what might be the actual culprit. When the Wilson brothers were nearly at the entrance to the ravine, Andrew fired the first shot, deliberately sending a bullet into the rocks above one of Hawkins' men. The startled ambusher revealed his position by returning fire wildly. That was the signal. Emma and her sisters began firing at different intervals, aiming near, but not at, the hidden gunman. The strategy worked immediately, creating the impression of a larger force attacking from multiple directions. Below, Matthew and his brothers reacted instantly to the gunfire, wheeling their horses and seeking cover behind a rocky outcropping. Their ranch hands followed suit, weapons drawn as they tried to identify the threat. Hawkins' men, believing themselves surrounded, began firing in all directions, their carefully planned ambush dissolving into chaos. Several broke cover, attempting to reach their horses, only to be driven back by well-placed shots from Andrew and the sisters. Emma saw Matthew surveying the ridgeline, obviously trying to identify their unlikely saviors. When his gaze locked onto Andrew's position, an unspoken communication seemed to pass between the brothers. Matthew nodded once, then signaled to James and Thomas. In a coordinated move, the Wilson brothers and their men began advancing on Hawkins's scattered forces, using the distraction provided by the ridgeline gunfire. The tide of battle turned quickly as the ambushers found themselves caught between two groups of attackers. "It's working!" Charlotte called, excitement in her voice as she reloaded her rifle. But the advantage was temporary. Hawkins, recognizing that his plan was failing, rallied his remaining men for a desperate stand. From her position, Emma saw him point directly at Matthew Wilson, clearly marking him as a primary target. Without thinking, Emma adjusted her aim and fired at the rock beside Hawkins, splintering stone inches from his head. The distraction was enough. Hawkins flinched away, and his shot at Matthew went wide. Matthew, alerted by the near miss, spotted Hawkins and advanced on his position with grim determination. The two men faced each other across a small clearing, years of hatred evident in their stance. "It's over, Hawkins," Matthew called, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden lull of gunfire. "Surrender now, and you'll face justice properly." Hawkins's laugh was bitter. "Justice? What would you know about justice, Wilson? You and your brothers have been breaking the law since you arrived in this territory." "We've done what was necessary to survive," Matthew countered. "You're the one who's chosen a path of murder and theft." "Murder?" Hawkins spat. "That's rich, coming from the man who benefited most from Judge Lawrence's convenient accident." Emma's breath caught. Here was the confrontation they had waited for. The truth about her father's death potentially revealed at last. Matthew's voice hardened. "We both know that was no accident, and we both know who was really responsible." "Prove it," Hawkins taunted. "Oh, wait, you can't. That's why you've been hunting me for 5 years without success. No witnesses, no evidence. Just like with the judge, clean and simple." "There was nothing clean about pushing a man to his death," Matthew growled, advancing another step. "Or about framing innocent men for your crime." Emma felt dizzy with the implications. Matthew Wilson was accusing Hawkins of her father's murder and of deliberately casting suspicion on the Wilson brothers. Hawkins gestured to his remaining men. "It doesn't matter now. You won't leave this ravine alive to tell anyone." The gunfight resumed with renewed intensity. From their position on the ridge, Emma and her sisters continued providing covering fire, but their ammunition was running low. Andrew had already expended his last rounds and was frantically signaling for the sisters to conserve theirs. Below, the Wilson brothers were gradually gaining the upper hand through superior tactics and determination. Emma watched Matthew move steadily toward Hawkins, seemingly impervious to the danger as he focused on his target. A sudden movement caught her eye. One of Hawkins' men had circled behind Matthew and was raising his rifle for a clear shot at the eldest Wilson's back. Without hesitation, Emma fired her last bullet, striking the attacker's shoulder. He cried out, alerting Matthew to the threat. Matthew spun, firing at the wounded man before turning back to find Hawkins had used the distraction to reach his horse. As Hawkins mounted and prepared to flee, Thomas Wilson emerged from behind a boulder, blocking his escape route. "End of the line, Hawkins," Thomas growled. Trapped between the Wilson brothers, Hawkins made a desperate decision. He spurred his horse directly toward the edge of the ravine, the same spot where Judge Lawrence had fallen to his death 5 years earlier. "He's going to jump the ravine," James shouted in disbelief. The ravine narrowed at that point, but it was still a dangerous leap for horse and rider. Hawkins drove his mount forward at full gallop, clearly preferring the risk of the jump to capture by the Wilsons. Horse and rider soared into the air above the ravine. For a moment it seemed the desperate gamble might succeed, but then the horse's rear hooves failed to clear the opposite edge. The animal scrambled frantically, loosening rocks and soil as Hawkins leaped from the saddle, trying to reach solid ground. His hands grasped the edge briefly before the crumbling soil gave way. With a final hate-filled glance toward the Wilson brothers, Jed Hawkins plummeted into the ravine, a terrible echo of Judge Lawrence's death years before. A heavy silence fell over the battlefield. The remaining members of Hawkins' gang, seeing their leader's fate, surrendered quickly to the Wilson brothers. Emma and her sisters made their way down from the ridge to join Andrew, who was already hurrying toward his brothers. The reunion was emotional, relief mingled with disbelief as Matthew, James, and Thomas realized who had come to their aid. "What were you thinking, bringing them into danger?" Matthew demanded of Andrew, though his tone held more concern than anger. "It was our choice," Emma interjected before Andrew could respond. "We insisted on coming." Matthew turned to her. his expression a complex mix of gratitude and bewilderment. "You could have been killed, all of you." "So could you," she replied simply. "We couldn't let that happen." Something shifted in Matthew's gaze as he studied her face. "You saved my life. That shot at the man behind me. That was you, wasn't it?" Emma nodded. "I had one bullet left. It seemed the appropriate use for it." Before Matthew could respond, Sheriff Daniels arrived with a posse from town, drawn by reports of gunfire. The scene required explanation, the Wilson brothers providing an account of Hawkins' ambush and the timely intervention of Andrew and the Miller sisters. Throughout the explanation, Emma watched Matthew carefully. He described Hawkins as a disgruntled former employee with a history of theft and violence, but made no mention of the accusation regarding Judge Lawrence's death that Emma had overheard during the confrontation. When Sheriff Daniels departed with the captured members of Hawkins' gang, Emma seized the opportunity to speak privately with Matthew. She found him standing at the edge of Serpent Ravine, gazing down at the spot where both her father and his murderer had died. "You knew, didn't you?" she asked without preamble, "about Hawkins' involvement in Judge Lawrence's death." Matthew turned to her, surprise evident in his expression. "You heard that?" "I did." Emma met his gaze steadily. "And I found your letter from Marshal Thornton in the metal box under my bed. The investigation you commissioned after the judge's death." For a long moment, Matthew was silent, weighing his response. Finally, he sighed. "I suspected Hawkins, but could never prove it. The judge and I had our disagreements, serious ones, but I would never have resorted to murder." "What happened that day?" Emma pressed. "The truth, Mr. Wilson." Matthew looked out over the ravine again. "Judge Lawrence and I met here to discuss the land dispute one final time. The conversation was heated but civil. We parted without resolution, he riding north toward town, me returning to the ranch. Hours later, his horse was found wandering, without its rider. A search party discovered his body at the bottom of the ravine. And you were immediately suspected," Emma surmised. "Yes, our public disagreements were well known. When the territorial government sent investigators, all evidence pointed to us, specifically me." He paused. But something felt wrong. The judge was an experienced rider. The route he took wasn't particularly dangerous. And there were tracks near the scene that couldn't be explained. "So, you hired Marshal Thornton privately?" Matthew nodded. "He found evidence suggesting a third party was present. Someone who staged the scene to look like an accident after ambushing the judge." "Hawkins," Emma confirmed. "Most likely. He'd been dismissed from our employ just weeks earlier for theft. He knew about our dispute with the judge, and he was skilled enough to cover his tracks." Matthew turned to face her directly, but without concrete proof. Accusing him would have only strengthened suspicions against us, so I've spent 5 years building a case against him, gathering evidence, tracking his movements, waiting for him to make a mistake. Emma absorbed this information, reconciling it with her own knowledge. "You purchased the land immediately after the judge's death, the very land he wanted for the courthouse." A flash of guilt crossed Matthew's face. "Yes, it wasn't honorable, but it was necessary. That land contains my father's grave. I couldn't risk another judge making the same claim." "And the territorial government simply allowed this?" Emma asked skeptically. "There was considerable chaos after Judge Lawrence's death. No immediate replacement was appointed. By the time a new judge arrived, we had improved the land, built fences, expanded our herd. The territorial governor decided it wasn't worth the conflict to seize it." The pieces were falling into place, creating a picture very different from what Emma and her sisters had imagined for 5 years. Still, one question remained. "Why keep all this secret?" she asked. "Why not clear your name?" Matthew's expression darkened. because Hawkins wasn't working alone. He had connections in the territorial government, someone who helped bury the evidence, who profited from the judge's death and the absence of formal law in this region. Without knowing who that was, revealing our suspicions might have put us in even greater danger. The implications were staggering. If Matthew was telling the truth, there was a larger conspiracy surrounding her father's death, one that extended beyond Hawkins and the Wilson brothers. "So what happens now?" Emma asked quietly. Matthew studied her face. "That depends, Miss Miller. Or should I say Miss Lawrence?" Emma felt the blood drain from her face. "What did you say?" "Judge Jonathan Lawrence," Matthew said evenly. "Father of 4 daughters who disappeared from Boston society shortly after his death. Daughters who might have reason to seek answers or revenge against those they believed, responsible for their father's murder." For a moment, Emma considered denying it, maintaining their cover story, but the events of the day had changed everything. The truth, it seemed, was finally emerging on all sides. "How long have you known?" she asked, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I suspected from the beginning," Matthew admitted. 4 educated sisters arriving together as mail-order brides was unusual enough to raise questions. When I saw your reaction to the mention of Judge Lawrence's death, I became more certain. "Yet you allowed us to stay," Emma noted. "Why?" "Because I understood your need for answers. It was the same need that drove me to investigate the judge's death all these years." He paused. "And because I hoped that in time, you might see the truth for yourselves." Emma absorbed this revelation, reassessing every interaction with the Wilson brothers through this new lens. They had known, or at least suspected, the true identities of the Lawrence sisters all along, yet had played along with the deception. "My sisters," Emma began, but Matthew shook his head. "Should join this conversation," he finished, "as should my brothers. It's time for complete honesty between our families." That evening, gathered around the large table in the Wilson Ranch house, 2 families faced each other with no more secrets between them. The Lawrence sisters revealed their true identities and purpose in coming to Cedar Ridge, while the Wilson brothers shared their side of the story, their conflict with Judge Lawrence, their suspicions about Hawkins, and their years-long quest to find the true killer. "We came seeking justice for our father," Emma explained. "For 5 years, we believed you were responsible for his death. And we've spent those same 5 years trying to clear our names and find the real murderer," James responded. "Life has a strange sense of irony." "The question remains," Rebecca said carefully. "Who was Hawkins working with? Who in the territorial government benefited from our father's death?" Thomas, who had been unusually quiet throughout the conversation, finally spoke. "Sheriff Daniels has been reviewing documents from Hawkins' camp. They include correspondence with someone identified only as the judge." Elizabeth frowned. "A judge was involved in our father's murder." "Not your father," Matthew clarified. "Judge William Holloway, who was appointed to replace your father 6 months after his death. He arrived with a reputation for being easily influenced by local business interests. Specifically, mining interests," Andrew added. "The same interests that would have been regulated by your father's stricter approach to territorial law." The revelation completed the picture. Judge Lawrence had been eliminated because his dedication to proper legal procedure threatened powerful financial interests in the territory. Hawkins had been the instrument, Judge Holloway the beneficiary, and the Wilson brothers convenient scapegoats. "So what do we do now?" Charlotte asked, addressing the question they all faced. "Our purpose in coming here no longer exists." A heavy silence fell over the table. For the Lawrence sisters, their years of planning and their very reason for traveling west had been based on a misunderstanding. For the Wilson brothers, the revelation of the sisters' true identities complicated the growing attachments that had formed over the past weeks. Perhaps, Matthew finally suggested, we consider what Judge Lawrence and our mother might advise in this situation. Emma looked up, surprised by the connection he drew between their parents. They never met, she pointed out. No, Matthew agreed. But from what I've learned about your father through his journals and what you've discovered about our mother through hers, I believe they shared certain values: justice, family loyalty, doing what's right despite the cost. Rebecca nodded, slowly. Father always taught us that justice shouldn't be confused with vengeance, that the truth was what mattered above all. And Mother believed in second chances, James added quietly, in building something new from tragedy. The conversation continued late into the night, two families bound by shared trauma, gradually finding common ground in their desire for true justice. By morning, a plan had formed, one that would honor both Judge Lawrence and Margaret Wilson, while bringing the real conspirators to account. In the days that followed, the Lawrence sisters and Wilson brothers worked together to compile evidence against Judge Holloway and his mining interests. Elizabeth's skills with bank records proved invaluable, as did the Wilson brothers' knowledge of local land transactions. Sheriff Daniels, once presented with the complete picture, agreed to contact federal authorities. As spring deepened into summer, Cedar Ridge witnessed unprecedented changes. Judge Holloway was arrested and removed from office. The territorial governor, eager to demonstrate commitment to proper justice, expedited construction of the long-delayed courthouse, located on a neutral parcel of land that satisfied both community needs and respected the Wilson family's connection to their original homestead. And at Willow Creek Ranch, the relationship between the Lawrence sisters and Wilson brothers evolved beyond their complicated beginning. The foundations of trust built during their shared ordeals gradually transformed into deeper connections, marked by mutual respect and, increasingly, genuine affection. On a warm evening in late summer, Emma found Matthew at their now familiar spot on the porch, watching the sunset paint the prairie gold. The federal marshal leaves tomorrow, she informed him. With Judge Holloway's signed confession, it's finally over. Matthew nodded, relief evident in his expression. Your father would be proud of what you and your sisters have accomplished, as would your mother, Emma returned. You fulfilled your promise to her. You kept your family together and built something lasting. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of the past finally lifting from both their shoulders. The question remains, Matthew said eventually, turning to face her. What happens now? You and your sisters came west under false pretenses, for a purpose that no longer exists. Are you suggesting we should return to Boston? Emma asked, watching his reaction carefully. No, he replied quickly. Too quickly, perhaps, revealing more than he intended. Unless that's what you want. Emma considered the question seriously. Boston represented a past life that already felt distant, a life of confined propriety and limited purpose. Cedar Ridge, despite its difficulties, offered something she hadn't anticipated finding when she first arrived seeking vengeance. I've been thinking about the schoolhouse, she said. With the new courthouse and increasing settlement, education will be even more important. And Rebecca has mentioned expanding the lending library James started in town. Charlotte seems determined to revolutionize ranching practices with or without Thomas's cooperation. And Elizabeth has practically taken over banking operations for Mr. Pearson. Matthew's expression lightened with each example. So you're considering staying? We are, Emma confirmed. Though the original arrangement would need to be reconsidered, given the circumstances. You mean the mail-order marriage plan? Matthew clarified, a hint of humor finally returning to his voice. Yes, I imagine knowing the brothers you were meant to marry were suspected of murdering your father might dampen romantic inclinations. Emma laughed despite herself. It certainly complicated matters. And yet, Matthew observed, certain attachments seem to have formed nonetheless. James can scarcely complete a sentence when Rebecca enters a room. Thomas actually smiled yesterday when Charlotte bested him in an argument about cattle breeding. And Andrew has been carving something in his spare time that looks suspiciously like a music box for Elizabeth. "And what about you, Mr. Wilson?" Emma asked boldly. "Have you formed any attachments that might influence your future plans?" Matthew turned to her fully, his expression serious despite the lightness of their previous exchange. "I believe I have, Miss Lawrence, despite our inauspicious beginning, or perhaps because of it. We've seen each other at our worst and our best. There's a certain clarity in that." Emma felt her heart quicken. "Clarity is valuable," she agreed, "as is honesty, which we finally have between us." "Then honestly," Matthew said, taking her hand gently, "I would like to court you properly, Emma Lawrence. Not as a mail-order bride or under any false pretenses, but as the remarkable woman you are, if you're amenable." The request was formal, respectful, and entirely genuine, reflecting the man Matthew truly was, not the villain Emma had imagined for 5 years. "I am amenable," she replied with equal formality, though her smile betrayed her pleasure at the suggestion. "Though I warn you, proper courtship with Lawrence women tends to involve intellectual debate, occasional horseback riding in inappropriate weather, and at least one instance of gunfire." Matthew laughed, the sound free and unrestrained for perhaps the first time since she'd met him. "I wouldn't expect anything less." As darkness settled over Willow Creek Ranch, 4 sisters who had arrived seeking vengeance found themselves contemplating a future built on reconciliation instead. And 4 brothers who had carried the burden of false suspicion for years discovered the possibility of new beginnings with the very women who had once sought their downfall. The mail-order brides had indeed brought transformation to the Wilson brothers, though not the kind anyone could have predicted, and the Lawrence sisters had found justice for their father, though not through the means they had originally intended. In the quiet aftermath of conflict and revelation, 2 families touched by tragedy discovered a profound truth. "Healing often comes from the most unexpected places in this cabin," Andrew said, running his hands along the rough-hewn bookshelf. "I can't tell you how many hours we spent reading Mother's books after she passed." Elizabeth joined him, her quiet presence a comfort in this space filled with memories. "Your mother had excellent taste in literature," she observed, gently touching the spine of a well-worn copy of Pride and Prejudice. "She believed books were windows to worlds we might never see otherwise," Andrew replied, a soft smile lifting the corners of his mouth. "Especially important for boys growing up in the isolation of the frontier." Elizabeth nodded thoughtfully. "My father felt the same way. He always said that books were the foundation of civilized thought." The mention of Judge Lawrence no longer brought tension between them. In the weeks since the confrontation at Serpent Ravine, the truth about the judge's death had transformed the relationship between the Lawrence sisters and the Wilson brothers from suspicion to understanding, and increasingly to affection. "I've been meaning to show you something," Andrew said, reaching behind several volumes to retrieve a small wooden box. "I finished it yesterday." He opened the lid to reveal an exquisitely carved music box. As the gentle melody filled the cabin, Elizabeth's eyes widened in delight. "Andrew, it's beautiful," she breathed, recognizing the tune as a Chopin nocturne he had played for her on the piano. "I wanted to give you something that would remind you of our time together," he said, his voice carrying a hint of uncertainty. "Regardless of what you decide about staying in Cedar Ridge." Elizabeth looked up at him, seeing the vulnerability beneath his quiet strength. Of all the Wilson brothers, Andrew had been the most deeply affected by the revelations of recent weeks, the youngest, who had carried the burden of suspicion without fully understanding its source. "I'm not going anywhere," she said simply, placing her hand over his. Outside the cabin, Rebecca and James walked among the rose bushes he had planted in memory of his mother. The summer blooms created splashes of color against the weathered fence, their fragrance sweetening the prairie air. "The new courthouse will need a lending library," Rebecca remarked, continuing their ongoing discussion about community improvements. "The children's educational materials at the school are woefully outdated." James smiled, amused by her determination to bring civilization to Cedar Ridge. "And where will these books come from, Miss Lawrence? The territorial budget barely covered. The courthouse construction. I've already written to my contacts in Boston," Rebecca replied, undeterred. "Several publishing houses have agreed to donate volumes in exchange for establishing the first formal library in the territory. It's excellent publicity for them." James shook his head in admiration. "You're a force of nature when you set a mind to something. A family trait," Rebecca acknowledged with a small smile, "though perhaps more productively directed now than when we first arrived." Their eyes met in shared understanding of how dramatically circumstances had changed. What had begun as a mission of vengeance had transformed into something neither family could have anticipated. Healing and purpose found in the most unlikely alliance. Near the corral, Charlotte stood beside Thomas, both watching critically, as a ranch hand worked with a spirited chestnut mare. "She needs a gentler hand on the bit," Charlotte observed. "She's fighting because he's using too much pressure." Thomas nodded agreement. "Jackson," he called to the ranch hand, "ease up and let her find her balance." The young cowboy adjusted his approach, and the mare immediately responded more positively, her movements becoming smoother and more cooperative. "Your eye for horseflesh is remarkable," Thomas told Charlotte, his gruff tone softened by genuine respect. "The breeding program has improved considerably since you implemented your suggestions." Charlotte accepted the compliment with a slight incline of her head. "The Wilson stock was already exceptional. I merely refined the approach." They stood in companionable silence. Their earlier antagonism evolved into a partnership of complementary strengths. Thomas's practical experience balanced Charlotte's innovative ideas, creating improvements neither could have achieved alone. "The cattle in the north pasture are ready for rotation," Thomas said after a moment. "Would you care to ride out with me tomorrow to assess the new grazing area?" The invitation was casual but deliberate, one of many such moments where the daily work of the ranch had become the foundation for something deeper between them. "I would," Charlotte replied simply, her usual forthrightness softened by the smile she no longer tried to hide in his presence. On the ridge overlooking Serpent Ravine, Emma and Matthew stood side by side, watching as workers constructed a simple monument. The territorial governor, eager to demonstrate a commitment to justice following Judge Holloway's arrest, had ordered a memorial to Judge Lawrence to be placed at the site of his death. "It seems fitting somehow," Emma observed, "that Father will be remembered here, where the truth about his death was finally revealed." Matthew nodded, his expression solemn but no longer burdened by the shadow of false suspicion. "Your father was trying to bring law and justice to a place that desperately needed it. His vision is finally being realized, even if he didn't live. To see it, Emma felt a profound sense of completion as she watched the memorial take shape. The anger that had driven her for 5 years had transformed into something more constructive, a commitment to continuing her father's work in bringing civilization and education to the frontier. "I've been thinking about the school," she said. "With Cedar Ridge growing so quickly, one teacher won't be sufficient. I'm considering writing to my former colleagues in Boston to recruit additional educators. Building a proper education system would be a fitting tribute to both our parents, Matthew agreed. Mother always said that knowledge was the true foundation of any worthwhile society. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the prairie in gold and amber, Matthew turned to face Emma directly. The past weeks had changed him. The hardness in his eyes softened. The defensive wall he had maintained for years gradually dismantled by shared understanding. "Emma," he began, unusually hesitant for a man accustomed to command, "I've been meaning to ask you something important." She met his gaze steadily, aware of how dramatically her feelings toward this man had evolved since her arrival at Willow Creek Ranch. "Yes? The arrangement that brought you and your sisters here was based on deception on both sides," he acknowledged. "But what has grown between us since then is founded on truth and mutual respect." Emma nodded, her heart quickening despite her outward composure. "It is." "Then I would like to formally court you, Emma Lawrence," Matthew said, his voice gaining confidence, not as a mail-order bride or out of any sense of obligation, but as the remarkable woman you are. The proposal was unexpected, yet somehow inevitable, the natural progression of a relationship forged through conflict and resolution, suspicion and trust, shared purpose found in the aftermath of shared tragedy. "I would like that very much." "Matthew Wilson," Emma replied, her smile reflecting the warmth that had grown within her. As they stood together overlooking the land that had brought them together through the most unlikely of circumstances, Emma reflected on the journey that had led to this moment. She and her sisters had come to Cedar Ridge seeking revenge against the men they believed had destroyed their family. Instead, they had found truth, purpose, and the beginning of new families formed not through deception, but through genuine connection. The sun slipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the prairie. In the distance, the lights of Willow Creek Ranch glowed welcoming in the gathering dusk, no longer a place of suspected villainy, but a home where two families touched by tragedy had found unexpected healing. Together, Emma and Matthew turned from the memorial site and began the journey back to the ranch where their siblings awaited. The future that stretched before them, both as individuals and as interconnected families, was not the one either had envisioned, but it held promise that neither could have found alone. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Emma thought of her father, whose pursuit of justice had ultimately led to this unexpected reconciliation. She liked to think he would approve of the outcome, different though it was from what she had planned. Justice had been served, though not through vengeance as she had intended, but through truth, forgiveness, and the promise of a future built on something stronger than the pain of the past. The transformation was complete. 4 sisters who had arrived seeking revenge had found purpose instead. 4 brothers who had carried the burden of false accusations had found vindication and new beginnings. And in the joining of these unlikely allies, Cedar Ridge itself was transformed, no longer a lawless frontier outpost, but the foundation of a community built on justice, education, and mutual respect. As the lights of the ranch grew closer, Emma felt a sense of peace that had eluded her since her father's death. The journey that had begun with mail-order bride advertisements had led to an outcome no one could have predicted. 4 brothers and 4 sisters, united not by deception, but by the truth that had emerged from their shared determination to uncover it. The Lawrence sisters and Wilson brothers had found their way through darkness to light, through suspicion to trust, through vengeance to forgiveness. And in doing so, they had honored the memories of both Judge Lawrence and Margaret Wilson far more truly than any quest for revenge could have accomplished. Emma squeezed Matthew's hand as they walked the final distance to the house, where warm light spilled from the windows and the sounds of conversation and laughter welcomed them home. The mail-order brides had arrived with hidden purposes, but they would remain for the most honest reason of all, because they had found where they truly belonged. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.